Good morning and welcome to the 19th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2025. Before we begin, can I remind everyone using electronic devices to please switch them to silent. This morning we've received apologies from Elena Whittam. Our first item on the agenda this morning is an evidence session with the Scottish Government as part of our consideration of the Natural Environment Scotland Bill at Stage 1. This week we'll conclude evidence gathering on Parts 1, 2 and 4 of the bill before we move to Part 3 of the bill next week. So, to discuss Part 1 and 2 of the bill, I welcome to the meeting Gillian Martin, the Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero and Energy. And also joining us from the Scottish Government, we have Leah Fitzgerald, Head of Nature Division Bill Unit, Lisa McCann, the Head of the Biodiversity Unit, and John McCutcheon, Solicitor. I beg your pardon, McCutcheon. Apologies about that. So we've got about, you'll be pleased to hear we've got about 2 hours allocated to discuss Part 1 and 2, and we have quite a few questions to get through. So can I ask members and the Cabinet Secretary and officials to be as succinct as possible. But before we begin, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to give a short opening statement?
Yeah, I will keep it short, Convener. Thanks for inviting me to give evidence on the Natural Environment Scotland Bill. I'm not going to list what the bill does. The committee knows that, and we'll have plenty of questions to allow us to delve into detail. I want to set in the record, though, today the wider context for the bill and why it's so important. There is an indisputable body of evidence that biodiversity, both globally and in Scotland, is in real jeopardy. Just like climate change, the loss of species and degradation of our natural environment is an existential threat to humanity. The actions we take to address it are fundamental to our well-being and our survival as a species. And the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy sets out a clear ambition for Scotland to be nature positive by 2030 and have restored and regenerated biodiversity across the country by 2045. Government, though, can't tackle this crisis alone, and we know that local authorities, farmers, crofters, ENGOs, national park authorities, to name but a few, are already undertaking vital actions to support our precious wildlife and to repair and enhance our natural habitats. But while our combined efforts to address the crisis to date have generated some successes, we need to, if we're going to meet our ambitions, we urgently need to accelerate and scale up those efforts. So the Natural Environment Bill both underpins and builds upon the vision set out in the Biodiversity Strategy, driving the actions we need to take to enable nature recovery on a national level, because tackling the climate emergency is a long-term endeavour, won't be achieved in the lifetime of any single parliamentary term. But by placing the duty on Scottish ministers to set and report on targets, the bill will enable us to hold future governments to account, ensuring that they continue to develop, support and deliver the lasting outcomes for biodiversity that we need to see. Other powers contained in the bill update environmental impact assessments and habitats legislation, modernise the way in which national parks are managed and reform deer management. They're all designed to support that high ambition and help us deliver over the 100 actions that we've committed to take in our biodiversity plan. So I'm grateful to the committee for the scrutiny of the bill to date. I've paid close attention to the views expressed by witnesses in earlier sessions. I know that some stakeholders disagree with some of the powers in the bill. There are others who are frustrated that we couldn't have gone further, but I hope to be able to address their concerns today. But I'm of course meeting with stakeholders throughout the summer, and I meet with the ENGOs very regularly. So I look forward to discussing the issues that the committee has and taking you through Parts 1 and 2 of the bill.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. So, you've set out that the Government has had plans in the past and ministers have had targets. Yet we continue to see a decline in biodiversity, and a good example of where we can see that is the State of Nature report in 2023, where there is a continued decline in biodiversity despite various attempts to stop it, and there's very few successes on specific species. So why is it that statutory targets, why do you think that is going to change the current situation?
Statutory targets are not a silver bullet. Targets are important to be able to, as I said in my opening statement, about keeping successive governments' eye on the ball with regard to meeting the targets and having to have the actions which underpin it. The committee will know very intimately a whole range of work streams that we have designed to provide policy and action, because that's where it has to be. If we just have targets, we won't achieve anything. But of course, the fact that they're statutory means that there has to be reporting associated with those targets and meeting the targets. So they can't exist in isolation. They are underpinned by the strategic framework. Obviously, that was published in November last year, which includes the biodiversity strategy, sets out that goal to be nature positive by 2030 and to have sustainability restored and regenerated by 2045. And there's also 6-year rolling delivery plans as well, which will have aggressive cross-sectoral actions. But there's also other plans that exist in other government portfolios as well. If you look at the work that Ms Goujon's been taking in the Agriculture Act, the whole farm plan, the work that she's been doing with ARIOB, implementing the policies in the fisheries management strategy in the marine environment, means that, and of course the work that we're doing across like the MPA network, for example, and the budgeting as well that's associated with those things, like the Nature Restoration Fund in this year's budget, other historic pieces of work that have been done to hold planners and those that make planning decisions account, like MPF4. They're all underpinning. So there's a raft of policy areas and duties upon public bodies, duties upon councils, for example, that will underpin this. It's not going to be easy, Convener. And I mean, I'm setting out 2045 regenerated and restored biodiversity. That's only 20 years away. So there is an urgency, and we have got to the point where we need to have statutory targets, because statutory targets don't just hold governments to account, they hold Parliament to account, they hold public bodies to account, they hold future governments to account. And this is far too serious to leave it just to chance and to hope that policies, because as you rightly said, Convener, the State of Nature report was not good reading, and that is why there has to be this urgency associated with the actions in this bill.
I guess some questions will pick up, but you're saying there's an urgency, but there's no indication of what these targets might be, or when they're going to be implemented. Should that not have been sort of drawn up in parallel with this bill? I know it's a framework bill and targets will change and reporting and whatever will change, and the right place to do that is through secondary legislation. But ultimately, we're just looking at the commencement of the Agriculture and Rural Communities Bills a year after the bill was passed. If it's urgent and we're looking to halt the decline by 2030, should there not have been more than just the ability to set statutory targets in this bill, but more meat on the bones to ensure that that urgency was reflected?
Well, the targets are obviously going to be taken forward in secondary legislation should this bill passes. Now, obviously, we're at the end of a parliamentary term, and the chances are that there will not be time to do that before the next. But I have to say that it's something I think that is going to be really quite sobering for a new Parliament coming in 2026, that this bill will be passed, which actually sets it in law that we have these statutory targets, and then Parliament has to get behind discussing what those targets should look like, and you're able to have that granular looking at each particular target and assessing how far we can go on each one. I think the agility associated with that in actually being able to scrutinise the targets, but also to have the setting out of particular targets, and maybe even the passage of this bill may even end up in having additional targets associated with it. I don't know how this bill will evolve. That's the beauty of parliamentary work. And I think that I keep on coming back to the agility point around some of the things that this bill is going to allow us to do. It's going to allow us to respond. It's going to be allowed for targets to maybe even change or be ramped up should we see particular pressures or particular changes in technology that would allow us, or even particular sets of data and evidence coming forward in the next parliamentary term, for example, where we actually are able to look at a target and say, right, we actually need to do more in regard to this, based on the sort of thing like a status of nature report. There's a great deal of work being done in our academic institutions and government, and with the likes of SEPA and our public bodies and Nature Scot, in actually gathering more data, which allows us to make those decisions, and it allows us to make them quickly and agilely as a Parliament and Government.
Thank you. I think it takes us nicely to a question from Beatrice Wishart.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and panel. Once the targets are set, will the Scottish Government review the biodiversity delivery plan in order to ensure it's aligned and capable of delivering on the targets?
I suppose the case is that the delivery plan has been set out, and all the other policy strategies around this have been set out with this bill in mind. But this bill, in terms of this part of the bill, is almost the kind of the statutory target setting aspect of that, as a result of the work that we've done in the strategy and policy area as well. But given that the biodiversity delivery plan is a living document, it's iterative. Everything around biodiversity, by its very nature, has to be iterative, because it responds to evidence. It responds to the data that I was just mentioning in my previous answer. It responds to changing circumstances. You know, as I said, the issues around any particular species or any particular habitat or any particular impacts that we're seeing as a result of climate change or anything else are something that we have to consistently monitor. And if there's areas in the plan that are not strong enough to address some of the evidence that we're seeing coming through, then of course they will be changed. Once the targets are set, of course that plan will be looked at as to whether actions contained within the plan and policies contained within the biodiversity strategy are enough to deliver on it. So I think what I'm saying is yes, Ms Wishart, but in a very roundabout way, just giving you an idea of just how agile we are working in this area.
Thank you.
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. Just checking where I am, number 3, is that? All right, no, I think I'm fine, actually. No, I didn't have a supplementary.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and panel. Thanks for your answers so far. Public bodies will be key to delivery here. And they will be key to delivering the Scottish Ministers' targets, but there's no legal duty on them to meet targets. How will Ministers ensure public bodies contribute towards the targets to ensure that they are meaningful?
So public bodies already have duties already. Now, I think it was the Wildlife and Natural Environment Scotland Act, would be 2011, actually made a requirement for public bodies to report on their compliance with their biodiversity duty. So that's already been happening for over 10 years, well, not about 14 years. And every 3 years, all of Scotland's public bodies have to have a report on that, but also an action plan associated with that as well. So that would be like Scottish Water, SEPA, Scottish Enterprise, Register of Scotland, and all local authorities. So they've already got that duty. If we're seeing, of course, that the action plans are not being delivered on, and that's, you know, one of the things that I guess that I'm open to investigating further, and I think my team regularly scrutinise those action plans and the policies that are set out by those public bodies in order to address biodiversity. Then obviously, you know, we need to address the delivery on those action plans, but they already have the duty.
And do you think that the public bodies will contribute meaningfully to what the Scottish Government's trying to do here?
Well, yeah, they have to. Actually, I mean, it comes back to the point that I made, government can't do it alone. The public bodies and the local authorities, they all have a reach out throughout the whole of Scotland. They have actions that are taken which affect the whole of Scotland. They make decisions that affect biodiversity. If you look at the duties that councils now have in the National Planning Framework, that biodiversity and emissions reduction is woven throughout that. They are not allowed to make decisions in the planning case that threaten both the climate change objectives and indeed the biodiversity objectives as well. In fact, they actively have to be building in resilience and improvement in terms of biodiversity and reducing their carbon footprint. So I think we're keen to always be continuing to review that. I mean, the biodiversity delivery plan, as I said to Beatrice Wishart, is an iterative piece of work by its very nature. Everything around nature, everything around climate change, everything around environment cannot be set in stone and then just that's on a shelf and forever no more. That's what, because things change by the very nature. You have to be adaptive. So I am always looking to see how we can ensure that that process that we have in terms of the duty that we have in public bodies is as effective as possible. We didn't think that legislative changes to that duty were needed because they already exist. But in terms of scrutinising the effectiveness of the action on those reports, the action plans associated with those reports, that's work that we need to do. I think that come back to the convener's central point is that we have not been able to halt biodiversity loss, that other strategies, I mean, that's 2011, that's been in place. We need to be making sure that it's strong, it's robust and it is delivery focused.
Okay, thanks for that, Cabinet Secretary. We've had concerns raised with us that the status of threatened species topic is too narrow, as there needs to be a broader focus on species distribution and decline. What would you say to that? I recognise that some of the stakeholders and the people that have come in front of you to give evidence on the bill have expressed that they think it's there's potential for a narrow interpretation. I want to maybe just take you through how the topics were arrived at, first of all. So they were recommended by an expert scientific advice, on expert scientific advice that was provided by the Biodiversity Programme Advisory Group. For brevity, I will probably just call them PAG from now on. They're a panel of experts that were chaired by the Government's Chief Scientific Advisor for Environment, Natural Resources and Agriculture, and they advised on all three elements of the strategic framework for biodiversity, and that the bill obviously includes their recommended target topics that we must have specific targets for. So they've been recommended by them. We also have the power within the bill to add additional topics as well. So I think it's interesting what stakeholders are saying around that. It will be interesting to see in future years if we may be required to add other topics. To the particular topic you mentioned, which was the status of threatened species, we felt it was important that it was the status of species, not the rarity of species. So that would effectively mean that it would cover more than just rare species, but it's species that are under threat now, species that have populations that are declining. They're not classified as rare, but they're under threat. They're having particular, we're seeing declines, we're seeing threats to their existence. They're maybe got restricted genetic diversity.
They might be under threat because of impacts to their habitat. There might be impacts maybe on their food chain, which is meaning there might be impacts on, if you look at things like avian flu, for example, might be particular species that have been particularly devastated by pathogens, etc., etc. So again, we wanted just to make sure that, and the PAG advised us to have that broader definition, because we didn't want to exclude species that we don't want them to get to the point where they're rare. We want to be able to make those interventions at the point where we're seeing threats to them. So that's why there's that broader interpretation, or broader definition.
And do you think, because there are these concerns, that you might be open in the future to making changes to this?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the way the legislation has been drafted allows us to make modifications to the topics, but also to add other topics as well. I think it's important to recognise, and I'm not telling the committee anything it doesn't realise, is that threats can come to species very quickly. Changes can happen very quickly. The effect of climate change can have an effect on a species very quickly. The displacement or the moving of their feedstock into other waters can have an effect on predators. Maybe predators, explosion in the population of a particular predator could have an impact on a species very quickly. So I think that part of the bill allows for that agility. I'll keep on saying that word, agility, around being able to respond to things and to look at the evidence and trends that are coming back and to look at the pressures that particular species are facing.
That's me, Convener.
Thank you. It was remiss of me not to mention that we've been joined by Mercedes Villalba, who'll ask some questions towards the end of the session. So welcome, Mercedes. And I also missed Tim Eagle. Tim had a supplementary on ensuring public bodies contribute. Tim.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I just wanted to come back on the point Evelyn Tweed was making about public bodies and their duty, because I think that's something that was expressed there that's been picked up quite a lot in evidence, that actually that it's just not worked. The duty hasn't been taken forward in the way we want. I'm very conscious, and I think it's hot off the press, that the Welsh Bill came out recently, and that's got some really interesting ideas about how, and I've written it down, basically that they will create a statement which will inform public bodies how they've got to comply with that duty, but also that they have the powers within that to designate a public body to a particular target or impact or whatever it might be. Did you have any cross sort of government discussions with the Welsh Government on what they're doing, and is that something you might consider here in Scotland?
Well, I have discussions with the Welsh Government very, very often on a range of subjects in the portfolio, and your suggestions there are something I am interested in. I think that's the beauty of the relationship between the Welsh and Scottish Government, is that we do often we learn from each other, and we take on each other's good ideas as well. I think I'm very alive to the fact that the point that Tim Eagle made, that where they've got local authorities that are not delivering on they'll be maybe delivering on the reporting, but they might not be delivering on the actions associated that are identified in the report that need to be taken. And having 32 local authorities in different parts of Scotland, there will be different ways in which they can contribute or not to this. And we want to get rid of the or not. We want to get rid of the ones who are not contributing. Obviously, we'll have different actions from, like, say, Highlands and Islands Council than we would from Glasgow City Council. But we want to be able to make sure that they're proportionate, and that their actions are things that they have identified as areas in which they need to go further. I think the Welsh idea is very interesting. It's a duty to give real guidance and direction to particular local authorities. I think we need to make sure that Verity House is always taken into account. We know local authorities are, of course, you know, in charge of their own destiny, and we don't want to be dictating actions on the ground that they have to take. But of course, there's already this statutory duty upon them to report and to put their plans in place and their action plans in place. So I think that what you have mooted is something that I will take away. Okay. And I just was in a meeting with the Welsh Government yesterday, so I imagine that in the next couple of weeks I'll have the opportunity to speak to them again, and I'll certainly look at some of the provisions in their bill.
Excellent. I mean, that was going to be my follow-up, actually. I'm not expecting you necessarily to be able to give a comment right now, because I think that only came out on Monday. But I presumed you might have had conversations in the background. But I think that's the point that that we've been hearing, is that actually what some public bodies need is a little bit more detail about what exactly is it that you're looking from them to do. And I think that's what could potentially be in this bill. So can you give the commitment then to, I mean, you said to take away, but will you write back to the committee and let us know what your thoughts are on that, so we understand that as we've got time for that, convener?
Absolutely, and of course I'll be in front of you for stage 2 as well. And of course, members who know me and have been through other bills with will know that my door's absolutely open to any members that have got suggestions on how bills can be strengthened. And indeed, if they're, you know, anything in the Welsh bill is something that you thought was something that the Scottish Government should put in this bill, by all means come and speak to me about it, because we can maybe work together on something as well. So, you know, it doesn't just have to be government that would bring forward any amendments. It's, you know, members. Now, I do enjoy working cross-party with members and making bills stronger. And I think that what Tim Eagle has just suggested makes sense on the surface. You know, because delivery has to happen at a local level. Delivery has to happen in a pan-Scotland way. It can't be sort of like a centralised document in the Scottish Parliament. It sits there. The delivery rests with all the public bodies and indeed our citizens as well, to be delivering on these very ambitious objectives.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet. So that is useful, because obviously the wealth legislation is fairly fresh, and I'm sure you'll need to look at that in a bit more detail. But any information regarding any potential amendments that you're considering to reflect some of the good stuff would be helpful. And also, could you share the PAC advice that you got relating to the target topics? You touched on the advice that you got.
I don't see why not. I'm just looking at my officials. I mean, obviously the advice that they gave was, we think, very robust. So I'm getting the nod from Lisa. So of course we'll pass that on. Yeah.
Did you expect any other advice to come forward relating to targets between now and the end of the bill process?
Well, obviously, if the team will be working on and getting ready for secondary legislation around targets. So that's not going to happen at a point where there's royal assent. That's work that's already in train. So I mean, I guess we're looking at that. As I say, the word agile and iterative seem to be my catchphrases at the moment, but that work's happening at the moment, because we want to be able to, at the start of the next Parliament, I would imagine, we want to be able to be putting those targets out for scrutiny.
Certainly any information about further advice would certainly be helpful to the committee as we move forward, whether that's published or in a letter to the committee. That would be appreciated. Rhoda Grant.
I could just,
Lisa.
Oh, sorry, beg your pardon.
Confirm, we have committed to publish the PAG advice, and we're just preparing that so it's ready to be published. Okay. And we'll continue to have that transparency in terms of the advice that we receive, to make sure it's publicly available, and have plans to engage with stakeholders to make sure that they have good visibility on the expert advice that has led us to drafting the bill in the way that it is, and then the suite of secondary legislation, which, as the Cabinet Secretary has said, is currently under consideration. There you go.
Very helpful. Thank you very much. Rhoda.
You'd mentioned about how things can change very quickly, and the need for flexibility to act to deal with that. I wonder if it would be better to have something on the face of the bill about, say, species control areas or something like that, where for a limited time you could, when you see a non-native species arriving and causing an issue, that you could designate an area for a limited time to go and deal with that, so that those powers are specifically in the bill but are kind of used in a more open and transparent way.
Ms Curt, I'm open to exploring that if that was something that you wanted to take forward. I think you're right. I mean, the nature of climate change will see that there's species arriving in Scotland that we've never seen before. Now, the real danger is that, that some of them might be causing threat not to biodiversity. Some of them might even cause threat to human beings and some of the insects that we might see. But also the pathogens associated with, some of the smaller species that will arrive, like the various strains that we've seen in bird flu, been adapting and changing. So I would be open to exploring that with you if you wanted to come and speak to me about something like that, and that my officials can take that away and look at that.
Can I just sort of add to that as well, that invasive non-native species is a risk that we're very alive to, and that there is some work being undertaken at the moment, and the Scottish Government will be consulting on a draft plan on non-native species with the aim of publishing a final plan later this year.
Thank you, that's helpful. Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, if I could just come back then to threatened species status, and I think you described, Cabinet Secretary, the need for a bit more kind of latitude in the way that kind of is interpreted. And I think you said in your letters back to the committee that could either be an explanatory notes for the bill, or on the face of the bill, it could be put into place. Would you consider an amendment in that regard as well, to look more at species that are in decline as well as species that are threatened?
Yeah, well, I hopefully I've set out, and you and I have worked closely on other bills together where we've been able to discuss amendments that you might want to be putting forward. I think my overall point is that this bill allows the flexibility in the future. It gives the power to add additional topics to the list of target topics as well. So obviously we've got the advice from PAG. That's what's in the bill in this draft. Once the bill is passed, the door's not closed on that there is the ability to add other topics as we. And indeed, there were some topics that PAG actually said, well, at the moment we don't really have the evidence base or the information, and maybe Lisa can help me out with the detail on this, and asked us some of them just at the moment, not to be put in until we have more. Maybe Lisa could flesh that out a little bit, if that's okay.
Would that include ecosystem health and integrity then?
Yeah, So the advice that we received from the PAG was that we don't yet have the right set of indicators in order to adequately measure those topics, but work is ongoing to determine what are the right indicators. There's lots of work, there's indicators that are in development, which might be ready at some point soon. So those topics remain under live consideration, but it just didn't feel it was appropriate to put those on the face of the bill just yet, because we don't have the right way to measure them.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, could, say, a trigger mechanism be put into the bill on that topic in particular, so it's not left hanging?
Well, I think that
there's a clear pathway, because we all know that ecosystem health and recovery is hugely important. It would be nice to put a target on it. If we don't have the data yet, then when could that be?
Section 2E, and I don't think this is based on, like, do you mean a trigger by a certain date or a certain circumstance? Because we've already got within the bill, Section 2E, subsection 5, has got they can be added to the target topics. So I think a trigger of sort of like a time trigger, whatever, wouldn't really be the right way to do it, because, as Lisa's just said, it's a bit based on the indicators and the development of the indicators. So that PAG are giving us the advice is that, develop those indicators, and then there's a point at which, when we're satisfied that we can actually, because there's not much point in having a target that you can't measure progress on. And I don't think there's not a resistance in putting more targets in. It's just a case of we want to put the targets in for which we have the evidence base, the indicators, and the prospect of actually being able to actually measure our success or otherwise against those targets.
So maybe the trigger could be the indicator.
Can I take that away?
Okay.
To see, because what I don't want is an arbitrary trigger that would leave us in the same situation of having a target that's not measurable. So maybe we can bottom that out. I'll speak to my officials and we can speak about whether or not that's doable.
Okay, thank you.
Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to you all. Just thinking about what you're saying about triggers and targets and issues around being flexible in this legislation, this framework legislation. We had Professor Gregor Smith in Health Committee yesterday talking about future pandemic preparedness. Avian influenza came into it, other invasive species, issues around diseases that viruses that mosquitoes carry, for instance. So I think, like, and Gregor said that the chief veterinary doctors are now working with human doctors and to look at how we do need to be flexible and dynamic in order to plan for whatever is in the future, right? So I'm thinking about that in terms of one way that this legislation is about being flexible, being dynamic, being able to adapt, especially just given the fact that I sit on Health Committee as well as Rural Committee, and there is a lot of crossover when we're thinking about how do we support climate change issues that come about.
I think you mentioned the pandemic there. The pandemic was an example in which that we had to look at some of the legal mechanisms that we had, which were not as responsive enough. So obviously we had quite a lot of things with sunset clauses and etc., etc. But that's just an indication of something that can happen very, very quickly and needs to be responded to very, very quickly as well. So I like actually maybe more than agile, the word dynamic is actually a really good one, because we need Parliament and governments need to be able to respond to things. And I think that it's the very nature of climate change in particular, which is meaning that some of the things that we maybe haven't seen before happen. Maybe some of the species that you see before are in Scotland. Some of the species that we had protections for before are no longer in those areas for which we gave them protected site status. They're not. So because nature changes and moves and adapts to the environmental circumstances as well. So I think it's very interesting that you also have linked that with human health as well, because I think that's one of the things that we don't talk enough about, is that the biodiversity in nature is inextricably linked to human health. If we don't protect our species in Scotland, and we are actually putting at jeopardy our food systems. We're putting in jeopardy our health of our environment that we depend on to be healthy as well. So I think it's an interesting analogy.
Okay, and I know that earlier the issue of additional topic areas was being touched on. The Scottish Environment Link suggested additional topic areas. I know one of them was about invasive species, for instance. So, and that's to do with being that on the face of the bill. What is your thoughts around the suggestions of Environment Link to add in additional topic areas?
So obviously I've talked about the provision in the bill to include new topic areas in the future, but we decided that we would go for a condition or extent of any habitat was included as a target topic. And that it resulted from sort of a merging of two separate, I suppose, target topics: habitat condition and habitat extent. We actually merged them on the basis that we didn't think that condition alone would demonstrate whether the outcomes of the strategy, the biodiversity strategy, would be achieved. So we had habitat condition and habitat extent merged to condition or extent of any habitat as a topic of the bill, as recommended by PAG. I think Scottish Environment Link also mentioned ecological connectivity as well. We didn't include that as a specific target topic because due to the need to select and consolidate target topic areas. But ecosystem integrity itself was seen as a high-level topic that was scalable. So, a lot of the things that maybe Scottish Environment Link and other stakeholders have said, oh, I would like to see this topic in the bill, we'd like to see this topic here. Two things to that. We have made sure that our topics are broad enough to include some of that, but also, as I said, we're not ruling out any topics for the future for which we can have more robust indicators as well. So hopefully that explanation of why we've chosen the topics that we have, based on that independent advice from PAG, based on them being broad enough to incorporate a lot of the concerns that stakeholders and all of us have around what we need to measure, but also that flexibility in the future to scale up those topics or to add additional topics. I hope I've given the committee the confidence that that's available.
Yep. I just hear about flexibility, being agile and being dynamic. It's allowing that adaptability in this legislation on the face of this bill.
Yeah, and being responsive, to changes in nature, but also being responsive to better data collection, better evidence gathering, some of the technology associated with that improving.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Do you think the bill would benefit from a collection of target-setting criteria? This was suggested by Open Seas, criteria along the lines that was included in the climate legislation, which could set the parameters for setting those targets.
So there's already criteria associated with target setting. Maybe if I could just take you through. So the consultation in 2023 was used throughout the development of targets. The criteria to be taken into account in the selection of targets I've got here: alignment with the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy high-level goals, alignment with the Global Biodiversity Framework, alignment with the EU environmental standards, including the nature restoration, and synergy with existing and forthcoming Scottish legislative frameworks and strategies. So all the targets, and this comes back to my original point about targets don't exist in isolation. The targets actually follow a lot of other policy development that happens. Not obviously we want to align with the Global Biodiversity Framework, we want to align with EU environmental standards as well. So those are the criteria for the target setting. But we also were mindful of the fact that our targets had to galvanise cross-portfolio work across government, cross-sectoral work across Scottish society as well. But again, come back to the fact they had to be measurable, achievable, and realistic as well. So those were the target setting criteria that we've been using. Will we continue to develop the criteria? Yes. In the same, come back to that word, agile, responsive. So I'm not quite sure what Open Seas thought. Maybe they have particular things in mind that they wanted to see as the criteria, and of course I'm happy to meet with them and any ENGOs around what they can be.
So are you really saying that this bill isn't actually bringing something new to the table? It's actually pulling together the various other bits of legislation in order to set targets on there?
No, the target setting criteria was as I laid out. So we wanted alignment with the biodiversity strategy, the alignment with the global biodiversity framework. So the target setting criteria was set out for this bill, and that was those were all the alignments that we set out. Those had to be the criteria for setting the target. So it's not a case of not bringing anything new. It's about the target setting criteria being interwoven into all these other goals and outcomes and frameworks that exist in biodiversity to make sure the targets were robust and that were measurable, realistic and achievable.
So it's really coordinating those other
yes,
pieces
I
of
suppose you could.
legislation.
Yeah, exactly. And that comes back to, again, to that whole point of, like, you can't just have an arbitrary target set out. There have to be criteria behind them, and they have to be grounded in is exactly all the other strategies that have been done to improve, to get us to 2030, to halt biodiversity decline and indeed to become nature positive and have species restoration by 2045.
Okay.
Thank you, Convener. Just looking, hang on 2 seconds, I'm going to bring up my page. It's always the way. We were looking at changes to designated sites, and there was a consultation back in 2024 where you asked for information on what could be done to basically change, what proposals could come forward effectively to change designated sites. But none of that has really been brought forward in the bill. I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on that consultation and why you didn't sort of bring some of the discussion points in that forward in the bill.
Right, so let me just have a look.
Am I asking the wrong question?
It's a perfectly valid question, but I think we've probably jumped into part 2 of the bill rather than...
Where was I meant to be?
1.
That's why I'm a bit confused.
I think we had another question on...
No, I've asked that question. Okay. Sorry, I'm sorry, this is my problem. I think I skipped one because he brought me in earlier on question 8, so actually, can I... I'll retract that question. I'll come back to it in about an hour's time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned a lot about being agile and flexible and responsive, and some witnesses have said that 10 years is too long to wait for a review of the targets, and more responsive measures should be built into the bill, including a suggestion that ESS should be able to trigger a review if targets aren't on track. So I wonder what your response is to those suggestions.
So the bill says it doesn't say every 10 years. It says not less than every 10 years. So there's actually flexibility within the bill to have a review. So there's actually opportunities within the bill. But given that the Environmental Standards Scotland, they already are the body that can advise us on maybe bringing forward any kind of review of targets. They're obviously, we set ESS up to be an independent advisor to us on whether we're meeting certain government objectives, whether our legislation in this area is working, whether our policy direction in this area is working. So I would have thought that there's actually the ability for ESS to advise that we review our targets anyway. But I think that's something I can take away just to sort of bottom out with my officials as to whether or not they do actually have the capacity, the power, if you like, to be able to do that. Because I think it comes back to that whole responsive thing, that if it looks like there's targets that are maybe not as robust as they could be, or they need looking at again, is our independent body, ESS, the body that should be allowed to say to government, we want to see a review of that target. But there's nothing in the legislation that says it has to be every 10 years. It's a minimum. The targets have to be reviewed every 10 years, but it's not less than, legal speak, not less than every 10 years. But can I take that away? That's something that I will look at with regards to whether Environmental Standards Scotland have that ability to hold us to account in that way. But it seems to me reasonable.
So you'll write to committee?
Yeah. I mean, I could look at that, and of course, again, Ms Wishart, you're welcome to come and speak to me about whether there's anything in stage 2 that you want to bring to the bill to bottom out that particular issue. Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary, in a different life, I was your Deputy Convener on the Environment Committee in the last session. Fond memories, of course. But I remember at the time talking about the way that biodiversity data was collected. At that time, I recall it was a bit ad hoc on a website that had been developed by some Australian organisation. It's going to be fundamental that we collect the right biodiversity data to ensure that it supports the monitoring of targets and how we move forward. However, there is no cost associated with collecting that biodiversity data from associated organisations and the community of organisations that are going to be tasked to collect it. So that's out with the likes of the ESS and the Scottish Government themselves. So how do you see these organisations being funded to ensure we get the right data collected to support the effectiveness of targets?
So it comes, you rightly say, it comes back to partnership work, and then it also comes back to the sort of coordination of data as well. So we've identified that there's a few sort of streams of work within some of the bodies that already exist in Scotland, like Nature Scot, supporting local environment record centres, for example. They've got a budget associated with that of just over £220,000. We obviously have our academic institutions already publicly funded by the public purse that we engage with, and we collect data from, we use data from as well. There's also data that comes in from various third sector organisations that maybe involve citizen science as well. If we identify any further costs associated with the work, we can look at any impact assessments particularly for the target setting, once we've set the targets and whether any additional funding is needed. But it's important to mention that it's also not just in this bill and this portfolio which has actions that actually improve data. Maybe point to something that I'm particularly pleased that both the Rural Affairs and Cabinet Secretary and myself have done. We've recently joint budgeted for LiDAR data to be collected across Scotland, and I'm very excited about what that's going to yield in terms of the sort of surveys that have been done. I believe that the planes have already been out in recording the data of what's actually happening in Scotland's landscape. It's going to inform a lot of the biodiversity work that we do, but it's also going to be involved informing the peatland restoration we do, the health of some areas, the forestry associated with some areas. So it's not just within this bill that there's spend. There's, you know, you look at the Nature Restoration Fund, there's data associated with the actions that generates as well. So, but if there's anything specific as a result of the target setting that happens in secondary legislation, then of course we would have to look at how we would fund that.
Yeah, I guess when you look at, there's a lot of data collected at the moment, a lot from the private sector, so whether that's you know, marine data from fishermen, or whether it's Scottish Land and Estate members looking at biodiversity from their perspective. There are some data standards, but there will not be, all the data will not be collected in the same way and published in the same way. So I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that for you to get the best value of that data, there will have to be some sort of capacity created to bring it all together, make sure it's all published in the same format, so that you know, baselining, whether that's LiDAR, whether it's collecting that from private organisations, whatever, it's going to be absolutely critical. So I just wonder whether you'd reflect before we get to stage 2 on what that cost might be, because we know the data's there, but ultimately we'll all have to come together to make sure that it's just in a format that's easily understood.
Yeah, and I remember our discussions on that from the committee that we were both on in the last Parliament. There's obviously it is voluntary for private organisations as to what data they might give us in that space, but I think that one of the, you mentioned the marine environment, one of the things that we've been doing is involving more fishers involved in terms of the data collection associated with anything to do with MPAs or anything to do with any kind of fisheries management measures, but also effectively the Scottish Government working on vessels as well with fishers is really important. But we have also those connections connections as well with offshore wind developers as well, and anyone working in the marine environment. But you're absolutely right, as of a holistic system doesn't really exist, but I think what I'm probably able to do is come back to the committee as to how we look to manage that data. But the costs associated with this bill in particular don't just reflect the spend across the whole of government and an awful lot of endeavours, which is actually critical, particularly in the rural affairs space as well. So, but we can maybe sort of like take your points away. I haven't forgotten that point as well. There's lots of data out there, but it's the coordination of it. And coming back to what Lisa was saying about indicators as well, it's going to be absolutely critical in managing the data and having robust data in terms of actually developing the indicators for targets.
Thank you. Mark Ruskell.
Can I ask why the 2030-2045 goals are not on the face of the bill?
Because I don't think they need to be. It's a goal. It's already in the biodiversity strategy. It's already a stated intention of all the policy documents. That's ambition and what we're working towards. I suppose my initial reaction to that would be I don't think goals and ambitions really fit well in legislation. It's the actions associated with those goals. I mean, I'm open to suggestions around references to. I think I mentioned the Global Biodiversity Framework. You know, as part of the kind of criteria for target setting, whether things like that, but standards adhering to the standards of, are in there. But ambition. Let me think about that. I don't know how appropriate that is, or how meaningful it is, to be honest.
I'm just. Is there any point in signing up to the 2030 and 2045 global biodiversity goals, and if we don't reflect it in legislation? I mean, it seems to be like the government's kind of saying 2030, it's lost. We haven't got a chance of meeting that particular target. We'll do what we can through biodiversity action plans and strategies, but you know, we're not really going to meet that one. 2045, maybe, but maybe we shouldn't put that in legislation because it binds the government to actions that are beyond what we can actually achieve working with different sectors. I'm trying to understand the thinking behind it. Does it make sense to have a target like that if you can't meet it? And if you do have a target like that, why not put it into legislation?
Because it's a goal.
Right.
It's a goal. That's
so what, nice to have, but not.
It's not nice to have. It's actually it's important that we work towards that. But the ability to set the topic targets are where the action actually happens.
Okay.
Let me take that away.
But you'd be up for reflecting the international commitments that the government signed up to somewhere in some form within the bill.
Let me take that away.
Okay, yeah. Right, we'll have a think about it. Can I just raise a couple of other issues then that are not included directly in the bill? I'm aware that, you know, we have an ongoing issue with marine enforcement. You know, we have MPA's lines on the map. Enforcement is very difficult to achieve. You know, there's a recent example, I think, of somebody who went in and dredged for scallops in an MPA, got a fixed penalty notice, but actually sold the scallops for more than the fixed penalty notice was worth. So there seems to be some fundamental issues around enforcement, fines and that kind of area. There's nothing in the bill on that, but would this be an opportunity to look at that?
It's not within the scope of the bill, but it is something that I'd be happy to talk to you about. I mean, as an issue, whether it's for this bill, I'm sceptical.
Okay.
There actually might be something that we're able to do that's more agile than that.
Okay, and then I think Rhoda Grant's already raised some of the issues around non-native invasive species, which I think did come up, actually, I can barely remember, it did come up in the 2004 bill. I think I might have had an amendment back in those early days on the non-native invasive species. It's still an issue, it's an issue that's getting worse. I think the issues that I've become aware of have been Nature Scott's powers to access sites, emerging issues around extension of Sitka spruce into native woodland restoration, growing issues around an exploding pheasant population as well. These weren't necessarily huge issues 20 years ago, but they are big issues to do with inns, which could, restrict our ability to restore ecosystems. Would you be open to kind of looking at those individual issues within this bill? Because it feels like this is an opportunity to change it. 2004 was a long time ago with the previous bill, which considered inns. This is an opportunity to do it now.
What I don't want to be is prescriptive about particular actions. I want this bill to be able to give us the agility and the way to actually address those actions. Okay. I'm absolutely open to scrutinising how the bill as it is actually allows more targeted action. But I think there's a number of things in this bill, particularly part 2, which will allow us to be more fleet of foot in terms of how we deal with emerging issues. And changing issues that are happening, for example, we can come into that when we talk about part 2, but the reason why I put part 2 in is to give us that responsiveness and agility in a number of areas. We don't need to wait for primary legislation to be able to deal with an emergent situation or indeed a trend that we have identified as happening that needs attention quickly.
Okay, but if there is a way to bring some agility for the future into the bill now to sort an issue, that's something that would be worth a conversation.
Yeah, I think a lot of things in part 2 actually allow us to do that, but I'm open to that because I think it's a real concern. I think also one of the things is that we do depend on quite a lot of volunteers in these areas to be managing some of them, particularly in our riverbanks, and we need to look at whether or not maybe the action plans associated with some of the local authorities actually need to pay more attention to things that are happening in the invasive species realm of things.
Yeah.
But I won't commit myself to anything.
Yeah.
We can have a chat about that.
Yeah, no, I understand there's a crossover between the strategy, the delivery plans and this bill, but it's just if there's something legally that's preventing a delivery plan from taking action, then this would be an opportunity to fix it, I guess.
Could have a look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Mercedes Villalba.
Thanks, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. I've got sort of 3 areas for questions, if that's okay, see how we do for time. The first one is around the purpose of the bill as set out in the bill as introduced. So it states in the explanatory notes, it says that the primary duty is to set targets in connection with nature restoration for the purpose of supporting and measuring implementation of the biodiversity strategy. Now, there's a concern being raised with me that by linking the purpose to the biodiversity strategy, we potentially create a loophole whereby a future government could water down the biodiversity strategy, and then the purpose of the targets is to support something that then has been watered down, rather than having the purpose in the bill as supporting whatever it is the overall aim or goal is. So restoring the natural environment, or whatever form of words the government chose to put. And so my question is really on whether the Cabinet Secretary would be open to looking at that potential loophole and looking at a way of tightening up that language to make sure that the purpose of the targets is to support, as you've referenced already, the actual goal, and not referencing a kind of external strategy which isn't legally binding, which could be watered down by a future government.
So I think I'd say a couple of things to that. Is that the targets themselves are very robust and will have legally binding targets associated with the goals that feed into the biodiversity strategy. So I guess the high level purpose is to align with the biodiversity strategy, but that informs the secondary legislation and the targets. So they're actually binding. Second thing I was saying is that none of us have control over who the next government is. The people of Scotland do, and you would hope that biodiversity is so important to the people of Scotland that they would not elect anyone for whom biodiversity was not a consideration. We can't future-proof any situation for future governments coming in and overturning legislation, bringing in new legislation which rescinds some of the goals of the previous legislation. I think that the way that we're doing this is robust, as in the biodiversity strategy has been laid out. That informs the target setting. The advice that we've got from PAG informs the target setting, and the targets are set in secondary legislation. Now that's up to the Parliament to decide what goes through. A future government which wanted to rip up this bill or rip up the biodiversity strategy would be scrutinised and held to account on their ability to do that. That's parliamentary democracy. It would be my answer to that. If there's anything in terms of the strengthening of the language, that's what stage 2 and stage 3 are for. I'm happy to consider anything, but I don't think that's a particular risk with this bill compared to any piece of legislation that we've ever passed in this Parliament. It's always subject to change based on who's in government next.
Thank you. I can move to my next question. Thanks, Convener. Next question relates to an area that's already been picked up on by Rhoda Grant and Mark Ruskell in relation to invasive non-native species. As Mark Ruskell's already said, we've got relatively strong legislation for invasive non-native species. It's illegal to release any species outside its natural range. But there are 2 key areas where blanket exemptions to that legislation risks undermining progress and damaging the natural environment. And they are the lack of regulation on non-native game bird releases, which Mark Ruskell's already mentioned, and the exemption of non-native commercial conifers. And both of those are exempt from the polluter pays principle. And so I wanted to ask if the Cabinet Secretary would be open to revisiting those exemptions through this bill so that we can help drive effective action on invasive species in order to prevent further biodiversity loss.
So there's certain elements of what Mercedes Avella just talked about around, like, release of non-native game birds and whatever. They're not in this legislation. And we wanted to keep the targets and the habitats regulations is the main part of this legislation. We don't have any plans to do anything on the release of non-native game birds, but in terms of invasive non-native species more generally, I think that the target topics actually allow us the capacity to deal with that. Both at the moment but also in future as the targets are set as well. This is not a bill that is prescriptive on that level of detail of action. It is effectively setting out the ability to have targets for which we've got quite a broad nature under which that action can sit as part of that target. I mean, invasive non-native species will have an impact on the health of a habitat or an ecosystem. So, of course, that's why PAG advised us to have those broad target topics. So it's not ruled out, it's just not specified in the legislation. I think is my answer to that.
Okay, thank you. And then my final question also relates to invasive non-native species, as they are a principal driver of biodiversity loss globally, and they're an intensifying issue in Scotland. They're having particularly serious impacts on islands. I'm thinking specifically of funded projects such as the one funded by Scottish Government on Orkney, the Orkney Native Wildlife Project, where involving highly mobile species. And I'm wondering if the Cabinet Secretary believes that current legal arrangements for tackling invasive non-native species are adequate, and in particular whether operational staff can access land with sufficient speed to tackle eradications of highly mobile species. And I think this relates to the question from Rhoda Grant earlier on about perhaps designating particular zones so that where we do have these highly mobile species, we can the operational staff can get access to carry out.
So the Orkney situation is talking about the stoat population. So let me take that away and look at it. Now, obviously, we've got the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy Delivery Plan has got a duty to implement the Scottish Plan for invasive non-native species surveillance, prevention and control, and to secure wider support measures to enable the removal at scale. So that already exists. That particular issue I'm aware of, but I think I need to take that away and look at that as to whether it's something that needs to be addressed in this bill, or whether we already have the mechanisms to do it legally.
Thank you. And I'd like to take the Cabinet Secretary up on her offer to meet to discuss ahead of stage 2.
Of course.
Thank you. We're not too far behind time, so I suggest we suspend for 10 minutes for a comfort break. We'll suspend this meeting. Thank you and welcome back. We'll continue with our work looking at the Natural Environment Scotland Bill and Part 2, the EIA legislation or habitat regulations. And I've got a question from Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. Bearing in mind the existing delegated powers in the area, why is a new single overarching power needed to enable Scottish ministers to modify Scottish EIA legislation and the habitats regulations?
I think this, I'll speak to this fundamental point. There's already habitats regulations, as you rightly say, that contain minor amending powers, but they're very limited. And they only allow Scottish ministers to amend the list of protected species, additional list of wild animals that cannot be lawfully taken or killed, and prohibited methods of taking or killing animals. Beyond that, they don't really have the flexibility that can be adapted to meet future circumstances of the sort that we mentioned in part 1. So this bill is introducing a bespoke power that's tailored for Scotland to modify those habitats regulations and the legislation that forms the EIA regime, and it plugs a legislative gap as a result of EU exit. Critically, there is a legislative gap in this area. So it will allow Scottish Government to respond to those evolving circumstances and be dynamic, as we've said, be agile to particular changes and needs and trends and impacts, maintaining, advancing environmental standards, responding to decisions that have been made in the past that are no longer relevant. But I think it's really important for me to set out that before those powers could be used, there are protections in place around that. The power can only be used when Scottish ministers consider that it would be in accordance to the following purposes, and I would really like to set that out for the committee. They can only be used to maintain or advance standards in relation to restoring, enhancing or managing the natural environment, preserving, protecting or restoring biodiversity, environmental assessments. They can only be used to facilitate progress towards any statutory target relating to the environment, climate or biodiversity that applies in Scotland. They must ensure consistency or compatibility with other regimes, and must take account of changes in technologies or developments in scientific understanding. Again, that comes back to the data and evidence point and the technology associated with assessing things in the environment and impacts in the environment, and to resolve ambiguity, doubt or anomaly, facilitate improvement and clarity of the accessibility of the law. And I guess that maybe comes back to Mercedes Villalba's point in the last session as well, about might be able to resolve things that are not actually ambiguous in the law, that are not actually working, or to improve or simplify the operation of legislation. So the powers that exist at the moment don't allow us to do any of that. And what I'm proposing with this power is the agility to be able to do that in responding to, particularly, I would say, the impacts of climate change. If you look at habitats in general, it might have actually been areas where maybe special protection areas have been put in. And I'm just looking to Leah here, in primary legislation that would have had to take place.
No, the special protection areas would be designated under the habitats regs.
Right, right. So we would be able to, using this power, be agile about. So say when we have a situation where we have a particular designation that is out of date because the circumstances on the ground literally have changed. It was maybe there to protect a particular species, it was maybe there to protect a particular ecosystem, it was maybe there to protect a particular situation where there was a threat to that environment, but that has changed. Maybe the species that are associated with it have moved further north or moved into another area as a result of climate change or whatever. So this gives us the agility to be able to act in those areas as well. But as I say, it's really important that those purposes, they're the safeguards. We can't do it willy-nilly. It has to accord to one of those purposes.
Okay, so we had evidence that there is that flexibility within the regulations as they exist. Are you saying that there was that flexibility within the regulations, but because of EU law, that that flexibility is no longer available, or are we getting contradictory evidence?
So I think obviously when we were part of the EU, we were implementing EU obligations through the Habitats regulations. There are no provisions in the Habitats regulations at the moment in order to de-designate sites or to amend the boundaries of the sites or to remove features from sites. And I know that the stakeholders have raised the regulation 9D, but the government has a different interpretation of what that allows. So the flexibility around protected sites is not, in our interpretation, possible within the regs as they're currently drafted.
One of the things that was put to me when I was preparing for this was about we thought it was the simplest way to deal with that was to have a bespoke power for Scotland, because if we didn't, effectively as a result of the EU's exit from the EU, the standards that we have and the legislation that's associated with the EU legislation would be frozen in time of that exit. So we would not be able to adapt beyond whenever it was that we properly exited the EU. It would almost be a moment frozen in time. So that's why we've looked to this bill in particular to fill in that gap. That means that we are able to adapt to future circumstances, actually to adapt even to some present circumstances, many of which I outlined in the previous session. Excuse me.
Okay.
Thank you. Is this the right question now?
We'll find out.
So if you ask it, I'll tell you whether it's the right one or not.
Well, I think can I come in on 17? Because I think my supplementary will run into that instead.
Certainly. I've got a supplement in this. So, in the evidence we've heard up to now, almost without exception, the NGOs think these powers are a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and that the flexibility exists at the moment. And the only people who appear to support the government's introduction of these overarching powers are government organisations, public bodies. So why is it that all the NGOs think they go way, way too far without the safeguards? And again, the Cabinet Secretary, you've talked about safeguarding things for the future. We've got to think about which governments might be in place in a few years' time and ensure those safeguards are there. So why is it that the Scottish Government feel that these powers are required, but nearly every organisation out with public bodies think that they're not?
Well, that's something I want to discuss with them, and I'll be doing, obviously, working with stakeholders and around their understanding of what we're trying to do. I have laid out the protections that are there as to how these powers could be used. The intention of these powers is in no way to dilute environmental protections. It's to be able to adapt to improve environmental protections in a literally changing landscape and environment, and to make sure that, as I say, we're not frozen in time and we don't have the ability. I set out in the 1994 habitats what the restrictions are there. Now, if we're able to be responsive and adaptive to new data, new evidence, circumstances that have changed in terms of and modifying, like boundaries of protected sites, or taking away protected site status where it's no longer needed, it's not doing anything, and then applying it to another area where it is needed, and being able to be fleet of foot in that. I actually think maybe I haven't communicated that enough to the NGOs. I want to have those conversations with them. I want to give them assurances. But to your point about future governments, I come back to what I said to Mercedes Bialba. Parliament holds governments to account. Parliament has to hold governments to account. That would, and I think that given that we have got the areas in which you're allowed to use these powers, I think that they are actually really quite binding. They really are binding. They do not allow governments, future governments, as part of this legislation, to be diluting anything. The provision in Part 2 is to get us to our goal of halting biodiversity loss as soon as possible. and then regenerating nature by 2045. I wouldn't put anything in this bill that doesn't do that.
I guess you probably hit the nail on the head when you said communication maybe wasn't as good as it should be, because when we had the government bill team in front of us, what seems like a lifetime ago, the only example that we heard at that time was the ability to use digitised documents as part of EIAs. And we heard no other reasons why these powers were needed. So I think the government's got quite a bit of work to do before stage 2 to ensure that the powers and why they're required and that the safeguards are in place. And that is communicated to the NGOs, because at the moment there would be some that would be minded to completely remove Part 2 altogether.
Could I give an example? I mean, because I'm in the same position when I'm starting to get to grips with what's in this bill and what it does, and I'm thinking about real-world examples of what these powers would allow us to do, and if they weren't there, what they would really inhibit in terms of nature restoration. So, say, a hypothetical example, that we have a special area of conservation that is designated because it's got Caledonian pinewood, for example. But the site, over time, and because of climate change and because of just changes in nature, the oak trees are beginning to sprout at this more sort of like the lower end, the warmer end of that forest. So, in spite of the fact that the climatic conditions would now favour oak rather than the dominance of pine, if we didn't have the powers to amend the HAB's regulations around this, we'd be having to strip out that oak. Even though it's naturally occurring, it's sequestering carbon, it's part of the changing nature of that particular site, we would effectively be having to get rid of trees because it is exclusively designated for primarily Caledonian pine habitat. So that's an example.
Hear there was scope to do that. That was something that was specifically raised when we had a visit to Abernethy Estate in Cairngorms, where there was questions over designation for an open space, whereas some natural regeneration was to be welcomed by other bodies. But there was the flexibility to allow exactly the example that you're giving just now within the current habitat regulations.
So there's no current powers within the regulation to remove features from the reason a site was designated. That's the issue. This would give us that ability to do that and be responsive to the change in the environment. So the example I've just given, I thought was a real-world example of where actually having that site designated as it was via like the European sites designation, actually, it's that whole freezing in time. That was fine for then, but 20 years on, 30 years on, whatever it might be, we are seeing that forest adapting to climate change, adapting more generally, and it's not a case of, it's not like the invasive species aspect of things, it's the fact we've got naturally occurring changes to that forest. So that's a real-world example of where we could actually be quite fleet of foot in changing the designation of a site, rather than having to wait years in order to do that.
Can that not just be done through guidance? There's a suggestion that you could have more flexibility by improving the guidance, particularly in relation to adding or removing features or denotifying sites.
Yeah, that's our interpretation, is that we need the flexibility in law.
Okay, thank you. Mark Ruskell.
I mean, this is a very, very, very small area. The bill in Part 2 is extremely wide. It gives ministers the power to effectively gut the habitats regulation should they choose to. I would just focus in, though, on this very, very specific example. You know, my understanding and the answers we got back from Nature Scott the other week there suggested it is possible to change the designation to effectively redesignate sites if that was required. There's also under Regulation 9D, there's a duty on Scottish ministers to adapt the site network. I appreciate the comment that Stuart Cunningham's just made that your interpretation is legally you can't do that, but DEFRA have published guidance to changes of regulations that enable site boundaries and features to be amended. So why is DEFRA wrong and you're right?
So I think I want to take the committee back to the first purpose of using these powers to maintain or advance standards in relation to restoring, enhancing or managing the natural environment, preserving, protecting or restoring biodiversity. That seems to me to be, and this is in the bill. This is the power can only be used in that area and other areas, which I won't go through again. They'll be on the record. None of them is about stripping out environmental protections in order to remove protections from an area that needs them. The area needs them, you will not be allowed to strip out those protections, given what I've said there. So I fundamentally disagree with the word gutting. It absolutely does not give anyone the power to do that. They have to have legitimate reasons that are grounded in enhancing and managing the natural environment to be able to do that. This is a power that is focused on improving biodiversity, managing the environment in a way that is nature positive, not about stripping or gutting or anything like that. And again, I come back to maybe our communication in this hasn't been strong enough, but that is the reason that power is in the bill. And I mean, I point to, you've heard from Brendan Callaghan from Scottish Forestry about that. If there isn't a power for ministers to make amendments, and any minor amendment would have to come through primary legislation, the opportunities of doing that are quite limited, given the parliamentary schedule and how long it takes for them to get legislation through. It's about good administration. It's about agility, it's about responsiveness, and it's about working with changing conditions in a way that reacts to that and works with the data and the evidence that is put in front of us that won't take years for us to take action.
But, Nature Scott said the other week that they could make these changes if there was guidance from government. So why isn't government, if this is a big issue about, features encroaching onto existing designated sites, then why doesn't the government just issue guidance to Nature Scott about how 9D could be used? If that's the big issue here, because it seems to be this is the only issue that's come up in committee beyond, the submission of PDF electronic documents. I'm struggling to hear from any industry sector body how the current provisions of the HABS regs are restricting economic growth and other benefits. What I'm hearing is PDFs and then a technical issue about site designation. I'm not hearing any other reasons. So I still don't understand why this power is needed. But to go back to Nature Scott, Nature Scott is saying if government gives us guidance, then we can act on it. So why aren't you giving guidance to Nature Scott when DEFRA clearly are
point to Nature Scott. Nature Scott have said, we support the changes. It doesn't make a lot of sense to use legislation that we can't easily amend. Giving the power to change it in relation to changing technologies, climate change, seems sensible to us. That's from Nature Scott. Now, Nature Scott are supportive of it. Now, it's our legal assessment is that we do not have the flexibility to be responsive enough to the changes that climate change in particular means happens in our natural environment. We wouldn't be putting this in if we had the ability and guidance to meet those objectives. I wouldn't be putting this in. This change and this part of the bill is there to allow us the flexibility to be adaptive and agile in a dynamic situation. Now, if there's any legal additional advice that I can maybe get from Stuart on this, but I am convinced that this is a power that needs to be used for enhancing biodiversity, being responsive to very literally a changeable environment, particularly as a result of climate change. And this bespoke part of the bill for Scotland gives us the ability to do that we do not currently have.
Yeah. Again, Stuart, when you respond, could you also just set out exactly what the new regulation, which was brought out in 2019, that Mark's referred to, 9D, what actually does it do? If it doesn't give the flexibility which we've been informed that it does, what does it actually do that the new regulations needs to enhance?
Yeah, sure. So Reg 9D essentially creates an obligation on Scottish ministers in conjunction with other authorities to contribute to the achievement of the conservation objectives of the UK site network. The management objectives of the UK site network. Now, there is this duty to manage and, where necessary, adapt. And I think it's the and where necessary, adapt has attracted a lot of attention. There is this DEFRA policy paper from 2021 that describes what they think the equivalent change in England and Wales allows. As I've said, and as the Cabinet Secretary said, we have a different view on that. DEFRA have not produced actually any guidance on how that is intended, how their interpretation would be intended to operate in practice. And when we look at how this process is done in other nature conservation legislation, like the 2004 Act, where we have the sites of special scientific interest, we have detailed provisions in that legislation about how you add features or matters to SSSIs and how you remove them. If you want to denotify a site, there are detailed provisions about the factors that should be taken into account, who should be consulted, and a detailed schedule about other procedural requirements. So, hooking all of that onto the word where necessary adapt, we think there needs to be clarity in the legislation about how we would amend the network in the ways that we may need to do so.
I think it's important to say that we don't have that clarity from DEFRA, and I want to bottom that out with DEFRA, because as it stands, we believe the provisions. Our assessment is that the provisions in Regulation 9D don't permit individual sites within the site network to be adapted in the ways that might be required to mitigate the effects of climate change, don't allow us to modify the boundary of sites or remove features from site citations, and nothing that has come from DEFRA gives us any confidence that we have that ability to do that based on Regulation 9D. If we did, we would have taken a different view, but that is, we have bottomed that out. We've no idea what DEFRA is doing in relation to this. In saying that, we are in communication with DEFRA and asking those questions directly. But this particular power allows us to mitigate the effects of climate change in a responsive and dynamic way, modify boundaries of sites, remove features from site citations, and everything that I have set out about our ability to be agile in protecting nature, habitats, species in that agile way.
Okay. Very briefly, Bart, please.
Yeah, I mean, clearly if there's an ongoing conversation with DEFRA about the application of the law, that's a little bit concerning to hear at stage one. But, clearly we've got several months over the summer and we'll see how that situation emerges. We did take evidence from JNCC, of course, on a four nations basis of responsibility for nature conservation, and their view is, you amend these powers with very great caution, was their words, and you make wholesale changes at our peril, I think they also added. So clearly there is concern here from agencies, from those monitoring the state of nature in this country, about any kind of powers in this section, but I'll maybe just leave it there just now. Yeah. I think it's food for thought.
It's not that we haven't had those conversations with DEFRA. We don't believe, we have done an analysis on 9D, and we don't believe that it gives us that flexibility and that ability to do what we want to do in terms of responding in an agile way to situations on the ground and in the sea.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I think mostly of what I was going to ask in my two questions has been covered regarding habitat regulations and this issue of the fact that, we unfortunately exited from the EU, and that's where we are right now. So I will be agile and flexible in my questions. I'm just seeking to understand, just correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't the need for these enabling powers, which arise because of our EU exit, it allows the ability again to look at what legislative gap has been created by that, so that then you can have the ability to amend any regulations or create regulations to enhance environmental standards and meet biodiversity and climate targets.
So we acknowledge that the bill provisions aren't a replacement for a power in the 1972 Act. So that EIA and habitats legislation originated in EU law means that as a result of us exiting the EU, that it means we've got the loss of that power. So it's created that legislative gap that we think that has to be filled. We don't believe 9D does it. Otherwise we will end up with legislation, as I said, that's frozen in time from our exit. So if we require primary legislation every time an amendment was needed to an EIA or habitats legislation, however minor that change might be, it's disproportionate, it's unworkable, it's not agile, it's not responsive to critical situations, it's not responsive to dynamically changing situations. That's why we want to be able to fill in that gap legislatively. We don't think 9D does it. We think that what the provision in Part 2 of this bill does.
Okay, thanks.
I think we do absolutely need to bottom out we understand what you're saying about not every single little thing should be done or can be done through primary legislation, but given that there's no parent act for habitat regulation or indeed EIA legislation in Scotland because they derive from EU policies, so a single power that the government are seeking for could open up to a whole range of substantive changes without adequate scrutiny. I think that's where the concerns generally come from.
I would say the opposite. The very fact that the powers originated in the EU law means that there is a gap now. The Parent Act was the 1972 European Communities Act, which, was a moment in time, and we left the EU in 2021 or whenever it was, and we fundamentally now have a gap. So this particular part of the bill is to fill that gap that we do not believe has been addressed and does not give us the flexibility that we had to respond to a changing climate and changing situations in nature and environment.
But I guess that again it comes to the crux of the question is whether EIA and habitat regulation should be done via primary legislation rather than regulation.
But as I said, that would mean that every amendment needed, no matter how minor, would have to go through primary legislation. And the legislative vehicles for that, might be a particular, another bill that might take a couple of years. I mean, we've been talking about this bill for the last few years, and it's only now that we're putting it through Parliament. It's agility. I think we are looking at the unworkability of that, the disproportionality of that.
But this is the point. You're focusing on the small pieces of legislation, but where the concerns are, it allows substantive changes in regulation. This is the issue. So it's not the time it takes for tiny little changes. It's actually that it allows substantive changes to be made without the need for primary legislation. The
power can only be used where Scottish ministers consider it be in accordance of all the following purposes that I've mentioned. Maintain and advance standards in relation to restoring, enhancing or managing the natural environment. Facilitate progress towards any statutory target relating to the environment, climate or biodiversity that applies in Scotland. Ensure consistency and compatibility with other legal regimes and take account of technologies and changes. These are the safeguards that are in there. This is not a power that can be used in a nefarious way.
They're fairly broad safeguards. Very broad safeguards.
I think that they're actually very compelling safeguards, actually. if there's additional safeguards we need to put in place, I'm willing to look at that, because I don't want this to be used. I don't want this power to be used in any loophole for any future governments. And if I think that those safeguards are robust.
This takes us on very well to the question from Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener. And I do think Cabinet Secretary has probably talked to the reasoning for this already, but how does taking the power in Part 2 accord with the conclusions of the DPLRC inquiry on framework legislation, which stated that powers allowing flexibility just in case are inappropriate?
So the DPLR obviously did their inquiry, and I mean, I think I've set out some tangible examples of where the power can be used, both in the policy memorandum and some of the examples that I've given today. So we could have updating regulations on forestry EIAs, allow for more effective enforcement where there's breaches of environmental impact assessments discovered, allow greater alignment with forestry and land management. But we can't predict every circumstance that is going to require the use of these powers. I was going to say the very nature of nature. It's the very nature of biodiversity and environmental protection is that it has to be agile. I think it's important that when we develop legislation, we need to consider future-proofing. Especially in matters around like the climate and nature crisis, where we do have to be agile. We could be required to act urgently, decisively, address new threats, emerging threats, and at the moment, every minor change to the EIA regime and habitat regulations could only be made through primary legislation. That does not allow us that flexibility, agility, and that dynamic approach. This is a critical situation that we're in here with both climate and nature crisis. We need the ability to be able to be fleet of foot in that. So I want to ensure that the bill has that correct balance between implementing the policy provisions but would have suitable engagement and appropriate parliamentary scrutiny. And I think that's the thing, I mentioned it before. Governments can't just do what they want in a parliamentary democracy. They have to be able to put that through Parliament, as I'm doing right now, but the uses of these powers will have to go through Parliament. They will have to be scrutinised. The Parliament will say yes or no to the use of those powers. And I think that that's part of the jigsaw that's very, very important. I think we're all worried, I know I am, we're all worried about emerging political discourse around the denial of the nature crisis, the denial of net zero. Very alive to that. We've seen it in other countries. But there are safeguards in this. There are rationale for doing it is for nature positivity. And obviously I'm willing to speak to anybody who thinks that there could be further safeguards in place. But if fundamentally a parliamentary democracy is the gatekeeper to the use of these powers.
Can I just come back and convener? So these will be safeguards for the future to help us with the climate crisis.
They allow us the flexibility in the future to adapt to changing technologies, changes in evidence, environmental impacts that we're seeing that need a quick response. I can't predict what they will be. And I think that's why the powers here, they're not prescriptive. We don't know what will happen. It's nature we're talking about. It's biodiversity. It's, you know, others have mentioned the invasive species and the threats that they have to particular habitats. Climate change in particular. We know that that's having a severe effect. You just look at the overwintering geese. They used to overwinter, I think, in the south of Scotland. They now overwinter in Orkney. You know? So, and Shetland. Maybe I don't want to get into the geese situation. But
that's another thing. But
that's an indicator. Look at the fish species that you don't see in more southern parts of the waters in Scotland, but you'll see in Miss Wishart's constituency waters, things that we're finding in different parts of Scotland. That is an indication that climate change is real. And if we've got the flexibility that I believe that this Part 2 gives us, we're able to respond to that in an agile way.
So the further safeguard would be parliamentary scrutiny to make sure that everything was working as it should be.
And indeed, the targets are important in that regard. If you look, and I mentioned to Beatrice Wishart around the ability within the legislation for the targets to be changed, and it doesn't have to be just every 10 years that they're reviewed. So whether those targets are working or not, that's subject to parliamentary scrutiny. And of course, there's all the reporting associated with the biodiversity strategy, with all the questions that we have in Parliament. A robust parliamentary system will scrutinise the use of all the powers in this bill. But as I say, inbuilt into the bill are the purposes for which these powers can be used. I think they're robust.
The legislation sets out purposes for modification or reinstatement of EIA legislation or habitat. Does it have to be one or all, or a combination of them all for you allowed to exercise these additional powers?
One or more of the following purposes.
So you're able to modify EIAs just on one of those purposes?
One or more, but again, this is the thing that Parliament needs to scrutinise, and you'll be making decisions on whether or not. So if they can be strengthened, I'm open to having that conversation. But that is where we have put our safeguards for the use of this power. Now, could a future government who doesn't believe in climate change and doesn't think that biodiversity loss is a threat to our very existence as human beings, it comes in, the Parliament's absolutely full of people that are climate change deniers, and well, that's obviously something that we need to always take into account in a democracy. They can do anything. They can rip up any legislation that they want.
Okay.
But I don't believe the Scottish Parliament is going to be like that, and I don't believe the Scottish Parliament is like that.
Thank you. Tim Eagle.
Thank you. It's an interesting conversation, and I think I do appreciate you putting on record that the aim here is not to take away the protections that we have in place. It's just to enable movement further in terms of biodiversity or climate change. But I guess that point the convener made around the risk of that. So you keep setting out the 4 areas in the bill, but if you only had one of those, like for net zero or climate, for example, then there is a risk there, isn't there, that a future government or your own government could say, well, actually, my aims for climate override my aims for that particular habitat. Is there a risk then that you might then, if you're talking about onshore or offshore wind, offshore wind, do you see that they could be quite broad in that sense?
This is the whole pitting net zero agaest biodiversity.
That's not the intention of my question, I should say. But
I heard that mentioned.
The risk.
So, I mean, well, first of all, I think that biodiversity loss and climate change are inextricably linked. All right, and we have to have protections and mitigations for both of those. And there are in every situation there are decisions that have to be made, have to take into a number of pieces of evidence around environmental impact, and those are robust. They are robust in the consents applications for offshore wind. They're robust for onshore wind as well. And I think we are going to be making them even more robust, particularly when we have got consultations going out about things like community engagement and benefits associated with developments, that they are going to become stronger and stronger as time goes on, because we need to be able to see that developments of any sort do not damage the environment, but also put things back into the environment as well. You look at some of the actions that have been taken by some of the developers that restore peatland, for example. Mm-hmm. You look at some of the actions that are taken by some of the offshore wind in terms of helping us with the data collection around seabirds and fish species, for example, and some of the, and a lot of them are voluntary things at the moment, but it's getting more and more. We're going more and more the trajectory where a lot more is going to be mandatory in that space as well. One of the interesting things about this portfolio is the restrictions around where I can take money associated with developments and where I can put it in terms of nature restoration. So if you take an example, just a hypothetical example, if we have a particular wind farm in one particular area, and there is funding coming from that as a result of the impact on the seabed, I can't necessarily take that and use it for other mitigations in nature that would have a material impact on the health of the sea. So, for example, it's very restrictive. So things are adapting and things are changing, but I think things are actually getting stronger in this regard as well. So, at the moment, Scottish ministers have got, you mentioned the energy, so I'll talk about what's happening in this space. Scottish powers have got an power to amend the 1994 Habitats regulations within the parameters set out in the UK Energy Act in respect to offshore wind activities, but that only allows for an amendment for offshore wind. So it doesn't allow for emerging technologies, and my islands colleagues, which a number of you are here today. You look at the nascent technologies of wind and tidal, and I know people representing the islands of Orkney here. It doesn't allow for any kind of flexibility there about the rollout of those technologies. It's only offshore wind. So it doesn't give us that flexibility. And the reason why it probably doesn't give us that flexibility is because it's in the Electricity Act of the UK, for whom those technologies are not really on the horizon yet. They're being developed in Orkney. They're being developed in the Highlands, the waters of the Highlands of Scotland. So this, again, is plugging a little gap that we have there and giving parity to other nascent technologies as well, where we have the flexibility there. So I think it's agnostic about the means of power generation, rather than just giving some flexibility to one sector of that power generation. We could be looking at wave technology in particular. Scotland could really be leading on that once it becomes commercially viable, and I wouldn't want that to be stymied at all. But at the same time, those protections that I've got in place in the bill will make sure that there's not flexibility that is just given for anyone to do anything in our marine environment. I think they're robust. And if we don't do something about reducing our impact on climate change, that's the biggest threat to our biodiversity.
I get, Cabinet Secretary, that you think they are robust, but all the evidence we have heard is suggesting that a lot of others don't think they are robust. And I guess what I'm trying to get at here is how we could change that, what your thoughts are on changing that. So I'd go back to the question that I inadvertently asked earlier on. You consulted last year on changes to adapt and improve the habitat regulations, and I think there were two elements of that consultation. One around more flexibility in designating for an ecosystem or habitat approach, and more proactive management. So what did you learn from that consultation? Because you haven't brought really anything into the bill from that. So what was it that didn't come out of that consultation that instead you've gone for this sort of broad power?
So you're right, in that we did consult. The proposed provisions in that consultation would address some of the immediate known issues around inflexibility and the wider constraints on protected areas with regard to making a contribution to tackling the biodiversity crisis. But they wouldn't address some of the deeper-rooted concerns over the legislative framework that we've got, the gaps that we are seeing, and the future-proofing of legislation to allow us to be adaptive. And we also we felt that it could have unintended consequences by bolting on additional measures onto an existing framework, which would have a really complex, would be extremely complex to navigate. So we took the decision not to progress protected areas, for example, as part of this bill, but to look at future Parliament, obviously depending on our priorities and who's in government, obviously is a caveat to that, to undertake a more fundamental review of that, and reform the legislative framework that covers nature conservation, including protected areas as well. A lot of what we do in this portfolio is about assessing the efficacy of what's been done in the past and whether it's working. Comes back to that, the whole thing about dynamism.
Okay. Sorry.
I suppose everything you're saying, what evidence is that there is an incompatibility between the current environmental standards and net zero goals? So to change this, you must think that there is I can't say the word, incompatibility between current regulations and delivering net zero. What is that evidence?
I wouldn't say there's an incompatibility. What I would say is that we have a changing environment for whom maybe if you've got particular protected areas that would not allow development as well. So say we have a particular site that has been designated and nothing can happen, on an economic basis nothing can happen on it because it was for overwintering geese or whatever that was. And then that protection is no longer needed because they don't overwinter there anymore, or they go elsewhere, or the protections associated with the biodiversity of that site are not required. It's about being adaptive. It's not about incompatibility. It's about being adaptive to the reality and to take the most up-to-date data and the most up-to-date evidence. So I wouldn't say there's a fundamental incompatibility with net zero and biodiversity. The two go absolutely hand in hand.
Sorry, Tim, I interrupted you.
It was just to take that the kind of next stage, I guess. I appreciate your offer that anyone can come and talk to you at any time. What I guess in my head I'm trying to avoid there is I'm sure we'll all work on amendments for stage 2, but actually ahead of that, you know, what are we learning? What are you seeing as a government in terms of the responses from some of the NGOs and others around the powers within the bill as it's laid out? So there's been quite a lot of talk about non-regression, and Spice quite helpfully actually pointed out that there was something called the REACH regulations. I don't know if you're familiar with those changes to chemical regulations, where rather than sort of go down that non-regression route, they've pulled out this slightly different route by sort of setting a very clearly defined scope for how those powers can be used, core aims and protected provisions. So I guess the question then is, what's your current thinking about how you might be able to adapt this part of the bill to better reflect the evidence that we're hearing?
So if I can maybe set out, first of all, why we don't believe a non-regression clause is something we want to put in. Non-regression clause would limit the flexibility needed to operate in a changing climate, but it's also very difficult to quantify what regression could mean. It's quite subjective, I think. So,
although you could define that within the bill, I guess.
Yeah. So. There's no simple answer to this. What effectively it's like, I know that you've heard from several stakeholders that like to see a non-regression clause in. We want to be able to adapt our legislation and meet the challenges ahead in a dynamic way, and we can't do that to effectively respond to twin crises in a way because non-regression we don't believe is something that is completely and utterly objective, I guess. There's no easy answers when it comes to environmental protections, but we believe that these decisions should be based on a case-by-case basis, where you might have very complex competing issues within a particular area, and that in order to make the right decision about what to do, you need to look at that on that case-by-case basis. Now, I think a non-regression clause would limit your ability to do that.
So what about the REACH example then?
So I'm willing to explore how we can, you know, if the committee and members don't feel that there's enough robustness in terms of the protections that we're putting in place, we can absolutely, of course we can talk about that. This is a first part in the progression of the bill. But for me, non-regression is something that I do not believe would be particularly workable and responsive to each case as it comes before us.
So just finally, convener, because I know we need to move on. I accept that point, but then, as I gave you with the REACH example that Spice helpfully pointed out, there are other methods of doing that that aren't specifically non-regression. So I guess I come back to that question I asked a second ago. What would be, I think, unhelpful is if we don't really talk about this anymore until all the amendments come flying forward at stage 2. So actually, if I don't know if you've had this conversation, but actually at the point, I presume you will over the coming weeks have this discussion with your team about how you can widen this, because I think that's what generally we're looking for from the evidence we're taking. Then actually, if you can come forward to committee with that information of what you could do, then that would be useful, because it gives us time to sort of think about that.
Yeah, so you've referenced to other regulations, the REACH regulations and everything. Obviously, you've made that comparison, and take that away. I'm open to discussing with members, but I'm also the whole point of us sitting in front of you today is to hear your concerns and to think about how we can bottom out some of those concerns. So absolutely, I'll take that away.
Certainly, we're hearing conflicting evidence around non-regression, where the very first session we heard that there was legislation that would currently stop non-regression with the alignment with the EU. But we did hear SEPA say that they thought there should be a non-regression clause there in the evidence last week. And, you know, again, across the board, nearly all the NGOs suggested there needed to be something included in non-regression. So there's certainly a bit of uncertainty around actually whether the legislation can deal with it currently, and that gives the safeguards, rather than your response today, which sounds it's just to give more flexibility. So there is uncertainty whether there is legislation that deals with non-regression or whether it's not there to give flexibility. That's not clear. There's
potentially other avenues we can look at in terms of safeguarding. I'm absolutely open to that. And we're having these good conversations even as I'm sat here listening to the concerns of the committee. So let me take that away, convener.
Thank you. Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, can I just go back quickly onto the offshore wind? And I think the government has said that offshore wind ambitions are not achievable in the current system. Now, I think I maybe asked you a similar question, Cabinet Secretary, when you came to the NZEC committee and you were dealing with the LCM, the UK Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which does allow some flexibility for Scottish ministers in relation to Electricity Act kind of powers. But can I sort of ask you the kind of similar question again, but in relation to this bill? How would you use the powers under Part 2 of this bill to provide the flexibility that's needed, particularly for offshore wind transmission infrastructure, which I think was the point that was being made in relation to the other bill?
Yeah.
Like, how would you use these powers? Because I think when you came to NZEC and you were talking about that bill, you said that the intention would not to be to change the environmental assessment regime. I might have picked that up wrongly, but
so I think. I mean, the premise of your question is that the Scottish Government couldn't meet their offshore wind ambitions, but
I
actually
think that's been stated by the government within the current system.
That's kind of been bottomed out with the negotiation with the UK Government, and in terms of what they've put forward in the Electricity Act and what they've put forward in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. But that doesn't account for other developments with outshore wind, and that would include, the transmission infrastructure that's associated with that as well. There's not much point in having offshore wind if you don't have the means to get that offshore wind into the grid. So we've identified there's been a gap there, but that's not the main. That's not the top line reason for these in the bill. Is to be responsive to a changing climate, and I think that the UK Government in both those bills have given us the flexibility with offshore wind developments, but there's still a gap for ancillary developments that would get that energy into the grid. There's technologies that are not offshore wind that are nascent and could develop. So against this future-proofing element that we're looking at as well, I particularly really want to make the point about the fact that we have got two particularly exciting but nascent technologies in Scotland, that be wave and tidal, that are not accounted for in any of the UK legislation that we've mentioned as well.
But in terms of the current regime that we have for environmental assessment compared to environmental outcome reports, which is the kind of embedded within the UK Planning Infrastructure Bill, does the current system work? Does the current system of environmental assessment work when it comes to, you know, marine, tidal, those nascent technologies? Is there a need to fix anything within that space? Or
this part 2 would give us the flexibility around that, so that sort of brings it in line, is agnostic about the technologies.
Okay. Okay, but in relation, but what you're saying then is that the issue that was stated by the government in relation to offshore wind ambitions not being achievable in the current system, that's by and large been resolved.
That's been resolved.
Yes. The Energy Act and the LCM.
Yes,
right, okay.
Absolutely.
That's fine. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry if it took me a wee while to get there.
I was just getting that clear in my head between the two committees that is the case, that's been resolved. Thank you.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart. Great. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I've got section 3C in front of me, which is about the purpose regarding consistency with other regimes, especially as that opens up the regimes to a race to the bottom, which has been proposed to us. So we've had concerns from stakeholders regarding this, but I think my understanding is that this is about aligning with environmental outcome reports in England, for instance. And so what would you say to whether this part 2 could be used for a substantial revision, for example, to the EIA regimes to align with the environmental outcome reports? I suppose the ensuring consistency and compatibility is what I'm after.
So you've sort of answered your own question in that the most likely circumstance that the Scottish Government would need to consider secondary legislation would be in order to align with a UK EOR regime, and that would be probably in relation to the marine environment, because obviously the UK Government has legislative competence in the Scottish offshore region, but Scottish ministers have got the legislative competence when it comes to the Scottish inshore region as well, so alignment there. It's important, I mean, particularly for renewable energy development, that there's consistency, as you say. So there has to be that degree of interoperability. You know, we don't want to be bound by a kind of false boundary in terms of who's got the power. So if two regimes have got fundamentally different legal requirements, then there might not be an option but to pursue legislative change. But again, this is about future-proofing, given that situation. We don't know what developments are going to be on the table in the future, and we want to be able to be, again, responsive and working with the UK Government in terms of aligning with things where that might be a barrier to any deployment that we wouldn't want.
And that example of like the offshore planning and energy, for instance, energy infrastructure is reserved to Westminster. So
we do the consents aspect of things, but the regulation associated with that is UK.
Okay.
So implications of that would be that statutory biodiversity targets couldn't be set in an offshore situation by the Scottish Government.
Well, it depends which waters we're talking about.
So offshore.
So we've got inshore responsibilities.
But not offshore.
Yes. So, but again, the interoperability of both those regimes. I mean, I think alignment with the UK Government in terms of their ambitions in this area at the moment we're in a bit of a sweet spot in that regard, because we have got, and also we both parliaments have got the targets in particular to net zero. You know, we've got 2045, UK's got 2050, so there has to be interoperability in terms of the ways that we achieve that.
But just on the marine side, it's quite obvious that there's different goals and targets with regards to the marine environment between Scotland and the rest of the UK around good environmental status. That's something that's incredibly important at the moment up here. So how is it all going to come together? So you've said how it can work with the inshore. How is it all going to come together with offshore? Because that's obviously important, particularly when we're, you know, only last week or the week before we were looking at salmon farming in an offshore environment. We've got offshore wind and whatever. So how do you foresee that coming together?
So are we suggesting that Scotland have responsibility for offshore as well as inshore?
Well, my question was, at the moment you can't set, there is no route for you to set biodiversity targets on offshore environment, only inshore.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer. The fact remains that the Scottish Government has got responsibility for inshore areas, and the UK has responsibility for offshore areas. I'm not sure, but in terms of the biodiversity targets, this goes to show you, this actually goes to exemplify why it's important that we have a UK government that takes into account net zero goals and biodiversity goals, as well as the Scottish Government. And the interoperability between the four nations is really, really important. Biodiversity doesn't have boundaries. You know, species don't have boundaries. We all have to work together in order to...
So that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
So,
the UK Marine Strategy is the bringing it all together is the UK Marine Strategy.
But you're responsible for good environmental status when it comes to marine.
Convener, given your constitutional allegiances, I'm not sure you want to go down this path, because I'm getting further and further into the area where we're saying, well, obviously we want responsibility for Scotland as a whole in terms of all the powers that we have with regard to the entire marine environment, then well, you know what my answer would be.
Yeah, but I think that it's quite clear. You have responsibilities with regards to biodiversity targets. The Scottish Government got responsibilities when it comes to good environmental status. However, there are separate goals between the two governments in relation to the marine environment. How can that all be pulled together so that you're able to discharge your responsibilities when it comes to biodiversity targets offshore?
By each individual component part of the UK working in concert with one another and having shared ambition is my answer to that. And where we don't have shared ambition, that was what actually jeopardises devolved governments reaching their targets. I would point to one of the biggest inhibitors towards us meeting our net zero targets is the fact that, for example, Scotland's electricity that we generate is too expensive for our citizens to use, so therefore they can't decarbonise. That is just the nature of the situation that we're in. That's been part of the UK. But we do have regular interministerial groups on all of this. I meet with my counterparts in Northern Ireland, Wales and the UK regularly on all these issues. But the fundamental part, and even just take net zero as an example, the UK will not be able to meet their net zero target of 2050 without Scotland meeting their net zero target of 2045 and vice versa. So therefore it has to be four governments working in concert with one another.
Yeah, but I suppose I'm looking at the practicalities of it. Currently, does it mean that UK targets set under the Environmental Act will apply to offshore? We know about the inshore, it's your targets, but is the Environmental Act set the targets on the offshore?
So good environmental status is a UK-wide endeavour, if that answers your question.
Well, I guess what I'm really asking is, will the targets, the biodiversity targets, if you like, be set under the UK Environmental Act for offshore currently?
No, we don't have legislative competence for the offshore area. So the targets can only be set in the inshore area where we do have legislative competence.
Okay. That's,
I'm glad we got there in the end.
Thank you. Mark Roskell.
I think we've largely covered the difference between the EIA and the environmental outcome report regimes, and I suppose we don't have the OR regime up and running yet, but if there was a need for alignment there, would the government consider issuing guidance first before using the powers here under Part 2?
Yes, I mean, but I think in my response to Emma Harper, I've talked about why that alignment could be very, very important. Obviously, we would want to try and align so as to not have a gap. Guidance, of course, not legally binding, but of course I think it's a sensible thing to do if there's a gap. But I mean, I'll take my advice from my official, who looks like she might have something to add to that.
I think we'd have to explore further whether that can be addressed through guidance. But if it's possible, then we would always seek to address it through guidance rather than legislation.
Okay,
thanks.
Thank you. Mercedes Villalba.
I don't have any further questions, thank you.
Okay. Oh, well, I get the pleasure of asking the last question. So we're going back to flexibility and whatever, and accountability. You wrote to us to confirm that Scottish ministers would lay any Part 2 regulations under the affirmative procedure.
Yes.
Where the content of the regulation would make substantial change. And I guess that's where my direction of question was before, substantial or insignificant changes. But there's those substantial changes that require greater levels of scrutiny. So what criteria are you going to use to decide and inform your decision on what is substantial and what is not? And why is that not set out in the face of the bill to give us some comfort that indeed, as you say, Parliament will get the opportunity to fully scrutinise any substantial changes?
Here's where I need some legal advice. If I'm okay to hand over to Stuart, who's got the detail on that.
Yeah, so the parliamentary procedure provisions in the bill have kind of two components. Section 2.6 sets out matters that must be done by the affirmative procedure. Any other regulations, there's a choice for ministers to whether that's done by affirmative or negative. The kind of established approach to that is more substantial policy changes would be done through the affirmative procedure, and more technical procedural changes through the negative. That's the kind of practice that was applied to the Section 2.2 power in the 72 Act. There is no direct criteria on the face of the bill, so that is a matter for ministers' discretion.
Okay.
We can look into it. We can look into whether there's more clarity needed.
Certainly. I think that would give a certain level of comfort if that criteria that you're going to use, that you've clearly said that's how you're going to decide how these secondary legislation regulations are going to be taken through. So consideration of perhaps having that criteria in the face of the bill would certainly be something that
let me take that away.
I would welcome. Thank you very much. And that completes our questioning. So thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary and your officials, for attending this morning. I now suspend the meeting for 10 minutes to allow a changeover of witnesses and a short comfort break. Thank you. I suspend this meeting. Welcome back, and we'll now move on to our third panel for today on the Natural Environment Scotland Bill, and we're now going to take evidence on Part 4 of the Bill. And for this discussion, I welcome to the meeting Jim Fairley, the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity. Welcome back Leah Fitzgerald, the Head of the Nature Division Bill Unit. We've got Sam Turner, the Team Leader from the Wildlife Management Team, Brodie Wilson, the Policy Manager from the Wildlife Management Team, and Hazel Riley, our Solicitor. We've got up to 90 minutes for this session, and again a reminder to try and keep questions and responses as succinct as possible to allow us to get through all the questions that we have this morning. So I'm going to kick off a nice straightforward question, Minister, you'll be pleased to hear. Section 10 of the bill updates the aims and purposes of deer management, which moves on to include to safeguard the public interest. However, that term is not defined within the bill, and in an online deer practitioner meeting that was held 2 weeks ago, there was considerable differences in what that public interest might be. So can I ask you, do you intend to define what public interest is in through secondary legislation or through a code of practice?
Well, no, I don't think we'll be doing it in secondary legislation. I think it's probably the public interest is widely used in legislation, and particularly in the context of the bill that we're looking at here. What the public interest might be in a Highland setting could be completely different from a lowland setting. So we won't be defining public interest in the secondary legislation. We don't think it's needed. It can also have unintended consequences, so you can actually define it and then it actually turns out that you need a different definition for something else. So I would suggest that at this stage what we're looking at is a general understanding of what the public interest is and a trust in Nature Scot that when they're having those conversations with the people who are relevant to the public interest test at that time, that we will find a common ground.
So on that basis, can I ask you what your definition of public interest is and what the public interest test would be? So whether you're in the south of Scotland or in the Highlands, what's your understanding of the term public interest?
Well, the public interest, that'll have to be set out in the code of practice in the individual circumstances. So my personal definition of public interest... But you just said it wouldn't be set out. My personal definition of public interest isn't the relevant point here. It's whether Nature Scot have the public interest at heart when they are making the decisions. Now, whether that's about nature restoration or whether it's about the community in which they are working in, whether it's the people who are actually doing deer management, all of those interests would have to be taken into account during any public interest test.
So, I'm a bit confused. You said that it wouldn't appear in the Code of Practice because it might lead to uncertainty, but then you went on to say Nature Scot would set it out in the Code of Practice. So what exactly is the position? And again, what is your definition of public interest? And given that you're the Minister, it's not really your personal view, it's what the government's view on what that public interest is.
So, public interest encompasses collective needs, values and interests of society as a whole, rather than those of individuals or specific groups. The expression is to be understood and applied contextually. What constitutes public interest in different situations may be different. It may also evolve over time. For example, at the moment, a significant interest for the public at large is the concern in relation to biodiversity loss and climate change. However, other public policy considerations may be relevant to any given decision, and that requires the SNH to take a very holistic approach to its decision-making in relation to deer.
So why wouldn't that be in a code of practice or set out in the secondary legislation?
I don't understand. We've already said that it will be set out in the code of practice.
So the explanatory notes for the bill do provide some further expansion on what public interest is. And so the explanatory notes say that interpretation and proportionality of environmental duties across different rural land holdings contexts, i.e. estates and crofts, etc. So there is a bit of further context in the explanatory notes that accompany the bill.
Okay, so just to be clear, it's in the explanatory notes and it's also going to be, the definition will be in the code of practice.
Yeah, my understanding is that there's a desire for clarity in the meaning of public interest in this context, and the right place to do that would be in the Code of Practice.
Okay, thank you.
Not in secondary legislation.
Okay, thank you. Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener. It's still morning. Good morning, Minister. How will the Scottish Government ensure that the public interest and environmental duties are interpreted and applied proportionally across areas such as you've said, from a traditional Highland estate, lowland farmland, or maybe even urban areas?
Yeah, so the public interest will be proportionate to the area that was talked about. So when I gave my previous answer, what we're talking about is it will be entirely different from West Perthshire as to what it's going to be in lowland Scotland or in urban Glasgow. So that it's not about the proportionality of the approach from government or this legislation. It's about how Nature Scott then define that with the people that they're bringing those plans into place with. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And how will it be determined for each area?
Well, it will be determined by that consultation process that they go through, that Nature Scott will then determine with the people that are involved with a deer management plan or with whatever it is that they're doing. That is how they will determine what that public interest is. Does that make sense?
Let's be convener.
We did hear concerns, especially in the south of Scotland, the lowland deer groups, that there was a lack of resources to fully meet public interest expectations. What's your response to that?
That there's a lack of resource to meet public expectations.
So if the public interest or the public, if in the Code of Conduct practice, as you've suggested, would set out what the public interest is, based on the public interest expectations, the deer groups were concerned that there would be a lack of resources to deliver what that public interest was.
When you say the deer groups, are you talking about deer management groups?
Yep, deer management groups, landowners.
Yeah, well, I don't see that that's going to be a concern. There is definitely a difference between what lowland deer management is going to do as compared to upland and hill management, because you've got the deer management groups in these areas. So is the concern that deer management groups are being targeted as opposed to what's happening in low ground? Because we accept that there is a difference between the two areas. Is that what the concern is?
I think there's a concern that some of these rural communities, particularly in the lowlands, will be overlooked, and the public interest expectations would favour centralised or conservation-led priorities rather than local livelihoods.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, what you mean is that the deer management groups think that their concern about how they make a living would be overlooked in favour of a restoration order? Is that... Sorry, if I'm being dim here, I do apologise. I'm just not quite getting the point that you're coming to.
So the Code of Practice will set out what the public interest is, and you're saying that will not be one overall code of one definition of public interest. Yeah. The issue is in the south that the deer practitioners are concerned that their views will not be, and their views on what public interest is will be overshadowed by what conservation groups and others, they talked about central belt bias, and those who had a different perception of what public interest is.
Okay, that makes sense to me now, so thank you for the clarification. That's the whole point of the public interest test. When we talk about the public, those deer managers are the public. They're part of the community in which they're living. So therefore, all of that would have to be taken cognizance of during any public interest test, whether it's low ground or high ground. All of these considerations will have to come into play.
Okay, thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Thank you. We heard mixed views on whether Nature Scotland should have a formal role on advisory panels, given that they're also the regulator. And I wonder what your reasons are for proposing the change and what safeguards will be in place to prevent any potential conflicts of interest.
I don't think there will be any conflict of interest, and the rationale by having a Nature Scot person on a panel would be so that if Nature Scot have got a level of expertise in a particular area, then they can be part of that panel. I'm not sure why there's a concern around this, and I'm happy to hear the committee's views on that. The panels are there to do the purpose that the panels are there to do, and if NatureScot can add to that panel ability to do its job, then I'm not sure why there's a fear of a conflict of interest.
It's as part of the advisors, they're obviously giving advice, but anybody else on that panel is going to know that at the end of the day, they're the regulator. So it's going to put a bit of an imbalance on those panels, because you've also got the gamekeeper sitting on the panel who's going to be making sure that everybody else complies with whatever comes out of that panel's advice. It just seems that it sets an imbalance for people.
Well, this was part of the Deer Working Group's advice when they sat. They were the ones who recommended it, and I don't know that I kind of disagree that there's going to be a conflict of interest, because this kind of line of question feels as though the purpose of the bill is to come in with a big stick. It's not. It's about our ability to work collaboratively, because there's no way that the government or NatureScot or any other individual body is going to be able to tackle the challenges that we've got about deer management on their own. This is going to have to be collaborative. So the ability to have someone from NatureScot sitting on a panel who's got a particular expertise, they won't necessarily have to sit on every panel. I'm not even sure how many panels we have at them. I think there was one set out in 2018 for a deer management group in Lowland Scotland. But having expertise sitting on a panel, I don't see as a conflict of interest. I see that as enabling our ability to try and get the best decisions that we can on how we're going to go forward in managing deer.
I guess where the conflict comes is that this is an advisory panel. They're giving advice. So I guess for government whether or not they take that advice. But if their advice was different to the decisions made, they then have to police the compliance with the decision being made, even if it was very obvious in the first place that was not a decision they agreed with or would have wanted to see implemented.
But NatureScot are a public body, so therefore they have a duty, and they must act reasonably and with impartiality when they're carrying out all the duties. And deer panels have also got to be approved by Scottish ministers. So if it's going to be approved by a Scottish minister, and NatureScot have to comply with the duties that are set upon them. And the purpose of these things, and everything that we're trying to do with this legislation, is to make things better. Everybody agrees that we want to make things better. Then I'm not convinced that there's a concern. There's I was going to say legitimate concern. If people have raised it, that's legitimate to them at that time. But I hope we're giving some comfort to the fact that this is not meant to create an issue. This is allowing us to get the best advice possible and every opportunity to try and do deer control.
Can I just get on record what your understanding is of the role of advisory panels? What's your view? What's your understanding of what the role of advisory panels is?
The advisory panels is to give advice to local groups on how they're going to manage their deer.
Okay. So I think, Rhoda, if you don't mind me coming in here, is there not a conflict of interest if that's then we have NatureScot, who ultimately will be the decision makers having a role in those advisory panels?
No, because it will be a representative from NatureScot, but the panel will consist of other people as well. But let's go back to the principle of what this is about. It would also have to be cleared by a government minister. And the panel's role is to have a conversation about how they're going to manage deer in any particular area. So having the expertise of somebody who's enveloped in this kind of work on a daily or a weekly, monthly basis, I think can only be a good thing, because it allows the broadest area of expertise to be available to be giving advice.
So what role is this government doing in setting the agenda, the scope of these advisory panels?
What do we do?
So Section 4 of the 1996 Act already sets out that panels can be appointed subject to the approval of the Secretary of State. Now, there's been 2 advisory panels that I can think of off the top of my head. The one in 2018 around lowland deer, and there was one previous to that when it was the Deer Commission for Scotland, and that was looking at the transition from Deer Commission to Nature Scot. They aren't used that frequently. We can see that in future there might be opportunities for them to be used more when circumstances are changing, but ministers would have to agree the appointment of a panel and the purposes of it and all of that. So there is an overarching role for government here.
Rhoda, did you have a...
Yeah. And, I mean, kind of the separation of powers is kind of a well-known kind of way of working. That the person who is in charge of policing something doesn't make the regulation, because if you don't agree with the what is being proposed, and those discussions have been carried out in an open forum, how can anyone actually trust you then to go and regulate the implementation of that in a transparent way? Now, you say, yes, of course they're public officials, yes, they're bound to not work in a way that's detrimental, but they're still human beings, and that's why people tend to have that kind of separation in powers. Yeah. Whereas this feels like a real fine if everything's working and everyone's in all agreement, but you wouldn't need those panels to an extent if everyone was in full agreement. It's how do you stop the conflict?
You've used the one word there that I think is really important in this, Rhoda, and that's trust. We've got to be able to trust each other. All of us have to be able to trust each other and what it is that we're trying to achieve here. And I'll go back to the point I made earlier, I think it was to yourself, Finlay, that Nature Scot are a public body and must act reasonably and with impartiality in carrying out their duties. And the deal panels must also be approved by Scottish ministers. And it's not compulsory for Nature Scot to have anybody on a panel. It will be if there is a specific area of expertise that a particular person could bring forward to whatever that panel is addressing.
I think also it's maybe worth clarifying that a panel isn't or doesn't need to be around regulation. A panel's there to provide advice to ministers. So in 2008-9, when the Deer Commission was merged with SNH, which is now Nature Scot, there was a panel set up which looked at that transition process, and there was also a panel set up to advise on lowland deer management in Scotland. So panels aren't just set up to inform regulatory action, they're also to inform advice on how we manage deer across Scotland. So I think Nature Scot being a part of that would be a useful thing.
So, just off the top of my head, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but say the advisory panel said we need to get deer numbers down to, 5 per hectare or whatever, and Nature Scot had said, actually, we just need 10 per hectare would be fine. But the advisory panel says, no, it's got to be 5. So then Nature Scot have to police that, getting it down to 5. Whereas, what confidence would people have that they would police that to 5 when they actually think 10 is the right, when everyone knows they think 10 is the right number?
But it's an advisory panel. They'll give advice.
Yes, but if their advice was different to the action that was taken, how can you then say that they are going to be an impartial enforcer?
I genuinely, I'm not getting the conflict here. It's an advisory panel. Nature's got to act reasonably and with impartiality in all of their duties. The panel must also be approved by Scottish ministers. I don't see the issue being as dangerous to the impartiality as other people do. I just have a different opinion, I'm sorry.
If I could maybe just add to that.
Yeah.
Nature Scot, generally, there's lots of things that Nature Scot will do because they're a public body. That's an expectation of them as a public body. Nature Scott's opinion might differ from stakeholders on some things, but that if it's government policy, then that's what Nature Scott do generally, and that's the expectation here. This is an advisory panel. If ministers agree with the advice, or it becomes government policy, or it's an ask of Nature Scott, that's Nature Scott's role as a public body. And it comes back to that point about trust in public bodies, I think.
I guess my question is, why the change? What can't be achieved on these advisory panels with Nature Scott as an observer?
Because they were observing, they weren't contributing, they weren't part of the panel, they weren't taking part in the discussions, they weren't in the body of the Kirk, so being part of that organisation.
What in addition can they achieve?
They can speak, they can give advice, they can bring their expertise.
Okay. Mark Ruskell.
I'm just wondering if there's precedent for that, of having environmental regulator there as an advisor, but also ultimately holding the power over regulation. So, whether that's something that Nature Scott are already doing. And I think, as Wilson, you described Nature Scott having a wider advisory role, but this is quite specific. It's about advising in a particular area on a particular plans in relation to deer management, but then ultimately having a regulatory function. Is there precedent there about how Nature Scott and other environmental regulators have managed those two responsibilities? How have they dealt with that perception that there might be a conflict of interest?
I can't argue that off the top of my head, but if we can't find it just now, we'll come back to the committee and give you any information we have on whether or not there's a precedent for that or not.
I think there's certainly circumstances where Nature Scott established groups, for example, to decide policy in which they could both sit on and they have a regulatory role. That might be slightly different from what we're talking about in terms of panels, but it's not totally dissimilar. I think there might be other specific examples, but we would need to come back to you on it, I think, around invasive species and that kind of thing.
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. Just a quick clarification, Minister. I can't see how excluding any experts in the ability to manage what everybody recognises as a problem with the different species of deer, whether they're urban, peri-urban, rural, highland, lowland. We've got challenges that we need to meet, so I can't see that excluding anybody would be beneficial. So that's basically what I'm proposing, that we don't exclude Nature Scott.
Well, that's kind of the purpose behind it, is to allow those extensive voices to be part of the conversation, to try and find the best solutions. That's entirely what this is about.
Okay. I think the difference is from having a formal role in the advisory panels, and it's now, from what it is at the moment, which is observers. I think that's where the concerns were. Okay. But I think you've addressed that. Tim Eagle.
Thank you. Good morning, Minister. Just a quick question around the reviews of compliance with the Code of Practice. As far as I understand it, the bill sets out that the Scottish Government can request a review at any point. In what circumstances do you foresee that happening?
There could be any number of circumstances. Currently, it's defined that it has to be a 3-year review. Yeah. The proposal here is that it should be a 10-year review, but things could happen. Things could change. There could be circumstances that require a more immediate action to be taken place, and if that's the case, that's what this provision is put in the bill for.
Any particular one, though? Does anything spring to mind particularly that?
There might be. We might receive a report on something that we would want to consider. Changing climate. There's all sorts of circumstances where government might want to ask.
Okay.
So it's purely to give flexibility to be able to say, right, well, you can review that in 10 years' time, but something happens 2 years from now. We go, well, we can't really review it until 10 years from now.
Okay.
So it's to
purely
give
for that flexibility.
It's purely to give that flexibility. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Mark Ruskell.
Yeah. So Section 13 adds nature restoration as a ground for intervention in deer management. However, control schemes under Section 8, Powers of 96 Act, have not really been used until relatively recently. Do you envisage that changing? There will be more use of Section 8 powers going forward in the bill, through the bill?
I don't envisage. There's only been one Section 8 that was signed off very recently. There may be some increase in the number of interventions. I don't envisage them going to the extent of being a Section 8. I think one of the beauties of the system that we currently have is that staged process. So there's got to be consultation, there's got to be conversation, there's got to be persuasion, far more than ever getting to the point where we're looking at forcing somebody to do anything. And Nature Scott do that anyway. We're going to try and find the exact numbers that we have.
Just reflect on that. I mean, in theory, the system at the moment looks like a good system, but clearly it's not worked at all, and that's why we are where we are with the nature crisis and the need to tackle deer management seriously. So, like, this is a kind of an improvement to an existing system. Why do you think Section 8 wouldn't be used so much going forward?
I think that the reason I wouldn't say that it hasn't worked at the moment. It's that deer numbers are where they are, and that we're now going to take action to try to get those deer numbers down. But there's a huge amount of goodwill in the sector. I've had a number of meetings with land managers, deer managers, and everybody's agreed that we want to do this, we want to get the numbers down. There are varying reasons as to why the numbers could have gone up. But there's a concerted effort, everybody's actually on board, and that's one of the things that I've taken out of my engagement with stakeholders across this bill. There may be individual bits about the bill that they're not happy with, but the overall consensus is that we want to do this, we want to do this collectively. I said right at the start, we're not going to do this on our own. So I don't see there being any more, because I genuinely see a concerted effort from everybody who's involved, and on the occasions where Nature Scott have to get involved, that can usually be done through deer management groups, through consultation with the people that are involved, and that I would very much hope will be the continuation of how we do this, because there's a collective effort to try to achieve the aims that we're trying to achieve.
Okay, so that will avoid the need for Section 8 in your mind, because the Section 7, Section 6 and those orders will work more effectively, is that right?
It would be my hope, yes, but we've got the ability to go further if we need to.
Okay. I mean, it has been put to us that the reason that Section 8s were not used in the past is because it would require a very high burden of proof, which could be challenged through judicial review, and I think that's been the suspicion for many years, that it's just been an inability to really robustly issue a Section 8 in a way that wouldn't be legally challenged on the basis of the evidence. Do you think that the bill changes that? Does it, particularly with this new grounds for nature restoration, does that provide more legal certainty now?
Yeah, I think it gives certainty to the industry and to government that we are working towards the same end, that we're working towards the same aims. Notwithstanding the point I just made that there will be conflicts in different bits of the bill, but overall, the aims and objectives, I think everybody is behind that, and everybody understands what it is that we're trying to do. And therefore, I would hope that we can resolve the vast majority of any issues that come up through negotiation and consultation with the people who are on the ground, rather than by any kind of enforcement.
Okay. Sorry, did Ms Wilson want to come in?
Maybe just to add, if that's okay. I think we've recognised for a while that the 1996 Act does a lot around deer damage, and that there's been a need to look at those wider environmental circumstances. There was an attempt during the Wildlife and Natural Environment Act to change it, and something was inserted into the 96 Act. But what we're doing here is to improve upon that, basically. We've learned from that, and this new power is about the context that we're in just now, and what we need, the ability we need to be able to take to tackle those kind of climate emergencies.
Okay, thank you.
Minister, your approach is very noble in that you're hoping that most of the challenges will be really dealt with deer groups and so on. But that's out of kilter with the financial memorandum, which suggests there'll be 1 or 2 deer control orders a year. Now, that's at significant cost to the taxpayer. So why did your financial memorandum is not as quite as positive in outcomes that you suggest that we're going to get?
Well, the financial memorandum is what could happen. not what will happen. And it's a kind of a, well, this would be the, from my point of view, would be the worst case scenario, that's what we were ending up doing.
Surely the financial memorandum should try to reflect as best as possible what is going to happen, not the worst possible scenario.
Yeah, but if we could see in the future, we'd pick 6 numbers and we'd all be millionaires. The point I'm making is that's the potential worst case scenario. We can't give any certainty as to what that's going to actually be. But if I'm taking a very as you call it, noble approach, and thank you very much, I'll take that as a compliment. That's because of the conversations that I've had with the sector. And it's that genuine desire that everybody has got to try to make this work. And that's how I've approached it right from the start. It's how I'll continue to approach it. We will try and get through the naughty bits that we understand that are there. We'll try and find resolutions for the issues that people have got. But by and large, the financial memorandum states what it states on the basis of this could be the worst case scenario.
Yeah, I think we did ask Nature Scott to come back to show us their workings out on how that was arrived at, so that will be helpful. I've got a question from Tim Eagle.
Thank you, Convener. It's just, Minister, I think you're right. I think there is a fair bit of goodwill out there at the moment, but I guess what we've heard in evidence is that there is a bit of uncertainty around the vagueness of nature restoration, and this kind of follows on from Ruskell's question. So I guess how at this point are you intending to sort of set out in guidance sort of clarity on what that means and in what circumstances that might be used?
Well, I think we all know what we know what damage is, we know what restoration is. We can see things being restored. We can see things starting to improve in terms of what any individual parcel of land is looking to try to achieve. Can
you give me a case study on that, though? What's the practical example of the ground of what might happen on an estate or a lowland setting?
Yeah, I think Nature Scott have actually written to you with some examples of already. The examples were, bear with me, I'm sorry, I've got a lot.
It's all right, no worries.
Say that again. Yeah, okay. So there's specific scenarios in the Central Belt. We've got a peri-urban setting. The aim is to seek assurance that longer-term deer management measures are in place to help deliver 30 by 30 nature networks and landscape-scale restoration projects. Example at Seven Lochs Wetland Park and the Climate Forest project areas. In the Central Belt, there's a mix of agriculture and small woodlands on the edge of a wider open upland space. There's a dispersed population in many small settlements close to major conurbations. That includes major trunk roads, and the example of the Campsie Fells. We've got rainforest. You'll get it in the letter. Sorry, I could sit here and read it all out to you, but that would be a waste of your time and mine. It's the examples that you're looking for. There's a pretty well-documented letter that you have from Nature Scott, and that will give you a lot of the examples.
And is the intention that will be fed into the Code of Practice?
Well, the Code of Practice will be developed. A lot of this will be fed into the Code of Practice. And again, it goes back to that whole point that we're all working together to try and find those outcomes that we're looking for, the positive outcomes we're looking for. And all of that will feed into what the Code of Practice will be.
Have you given any thought, just out of interest, of asking your officials to work on the Code of Practice now, almost so that we can have a draft before stage 3, so that we can scrutinise it before the end of the bill, well, given that actually it's quite an important document, isn't it?
You're right, the Code of Practice is important, but it wouldn't be feasible for us to be able to do that work before we get to stage 3. The Code of Practice, we can be working on stuff at the moment, but to have a final Code of Practice deliverable is going to have to be done later, I'm afraid.
Okay.
There was stakeholder suggestion a draft Code of Practice would be helpful to sort of set the direction of travel and allow deer practitioners to at least to be able to anticipate what that Code of Practice is. So would you consider publishing a draft Code of Practice prior to stage 3?
Again, no, I don't think that would be appropriate at this stage. The Code of Practice will be worked out with stakeholders. It will be worked out with the people that it's going to be relevant to. And we will bring forward the Code of Practice. We're not going to have time to be able to do it before we get to the stage 3 bill. But clearly, as I've stated right from the outset, this will be done in absolute consultation with stakeholders so that we get it right.
Yeah, I guess we will potentially pass this at stage 3, what would be helpful is that the grounds on which some of these interventions will be made, the Parliament had a chance to scrutinise that or certainly have some understanding of what the code of practice might look like. And that could be delivered if you so desired, Minister, to be helpful in a draft form.
There is a code of practice already. That's already there. So, you know, whatever develops with the follow-on from that, you're going to have there is a code of practice that you can already look at. That kind of sets out the barometer for what it is that we're trying to do. But the new code of practice may well add stuff, it may well take stuff away. But all that will be done in consultation with the stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Thanks, Convener. Much of the operational detail regarding how Nature Scot would intervene is being left to the Code of Practice. So why has the Scottish Government opted for that approach rather than outlining the conditions on the face of the bill?
If you put it in legislation, it becomes primary legislation. So we want it in Code of Practice so that we have flexibility, because things may change, as we said earlier on. Having it on the face of the bill becomes primary legislation, and there's one other bill that I know of right now that I am dealing with, where if you set it out in legislation and then people want to change stuff later on because circumstances have changed, then that's a whole different problem to deal with. So setting it out in the Code of Practice allows us to have the flexibility to be able to get it right.
If I might add to that, just to say that the 1996 Act already sets out quite a detailed instruction for Nature Scot in terms of the things they must do when it comes to working with the landowner or occupier, the steps they must take between going from that voluntary approach to the compulsory approach. So while the Code of Practice will set out more detail on the circumstances in which they might become involved, the actual process for the work they must do in terms of that engagement is set out in legislation already.
Okay.
Okay. Tim Eagle, do you have a supplementary?
It was just to follow on from that. So my understanding within the bill is that Nature Scot must have to have regard to the Code of Practice, and there's been some queries around whether that is a strong enough or a fair enough term. What's your own thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is.
But what? So in fairness, then, why do you think there are some stakeholders? I mean, you talked about goodwill earlier on, and I'll keep coming back to that because I think you have goodwill. But the risk of things like nature restoration or vague terms like have regard to, I think, risks undermining that goodwill, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, I don't think so, because it goes back to the point that Bruce just pointed something out. It's made something I should have read out probably. A statutory requirement to have regard to something is to understood as being a requirement to consider it. So therefore, if they've got a requirement to consider it, that also goes back into that piece that I was talking about earlier on about the duties of Nature Scot as a public body and what they have to bear in mind in any consideration that they have going forward. So if you look at all of that in the round, then I think that should give confidence that people will have a good enough working relationship with Nature Scot to be able to actually develop the practices that we're looking to get delivered.
But if stakeholders don't feel that's the case, why would you not give consideration to strengthening that wording slightly on the face of the bill?
Well, I think we'll just have to work on that to get that working relationship better. But right now, from all the evidence that I'm seeing, all the engagement that I've had, by and large, there is a very good working relationship between the deer management groups, Nature Scot, and of course there's going to be conflicts. That, you know, we can't avoid having some disputes about certain areas, but by and large I think there is a general degree of trust which I hope we will continue to build on.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I think just on that last point as well, I think although the Code of Practice will have more flexibility than the legislation, there's also, I guess, a degree of risk of strengthening the wording from have regard to something else, because not all circumstances in the Code of Practice will apply to all areas of land. So there'll be some areas where certain parts of the Code of Practice apply, you know, and other areas where it won't. So having something strengthened to say something like must comply or something like that, again, you lose that flexibility, and we've just got to trust that Nature Scot will take into account what is relevant to each relevant landowner and land area.
I fully accept that point. I guess the problem for practitioners on the ground, though, is that whilst it gives flexibility to government and public bodies to respond, they are then uncertain of what could happen in any given situation. Now, there's no way on the face of a bill you could ever lay out everything, but I guess it goes back to that point about relationship, doesn't it? That the stakeholders need to be clear, or businesses need to be clear, that actually of what Nature Scott's intentions might be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think to flip it, though, it also gives flexibility to the landowner and land manager, because they then, you know, if there's something that says they must do something, which actually they think this doesn't apply to my piece of land, or actually I think my circumstances are different, then they're going to struggle because the legislation says that they have to do something. Whereas if it's have regard, they can have a conversation with Nature Scott and come to a reasonable decision.
I think that's an important point to be on record, and you foresee that dialogue and relationship. You've already said that, but I just want to clarify that point.
We're seeing this already.
Yes,
it's happening all over the country. That those relationships are good. Yeah. They're workable, and that's the way I would hope that we continue.
Okay, thank you.
Again, I guess the concerns are it would allow Nature Scott to pick and choose when it abided by the regulations, as well as when pick and choose when they decided to enforce the regulations. So that's the issue with flexibility. There is not the safeguards to land managers, deer practitioners, that Nature Scott will abide by those regulations.
Well, they certainly have to abide by the law, but if we're talking about the code of practice is there to work collectively and collaboratively.
Yeah, but I think the fact is, have regard to the code would suggest that in some circumstances Nature Scott may not need to follow the regulations set out in the code if you're talking about flexibility.
Do you want to answer that?
So there's maybe just two things to say here. The 96 Act does already require Nature Scott to have due regard to the code. The wording is slightly different, but they are required to have regard. But what we're talking about here really, I think, is a concern about Nature Scott not complying with the code of practice and maybe requiring something of land managers.
Absolutely,
yes.
Yeah.
If that was the case, in order to be able to compel land managers to do anything, that process would need to be signed off by ministers, and there would be a period during which people can object to that requirement. So, although I do think it's right to say that Nature Scott, we must put trust in Nature Scott as the nature agency. If landowners had a concern about that, they would make that case to ministers, and we would review that before that came in. If at that point we agreed it and they still felt that was inappropriate, it can be appealed to the land court. So there are protections in place, I think, for that circumstance.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Rhoda Grant, did you have a supplementary?
Yeah. We see more that farmers are taking on kind of environmental responsibilities as part of their normal work. But one of their complaints about deer management is that they can manage deer if they find them on their land, but as often as not, the deer have gone by the time they see the damage. And I wonder if it's possible to put something in the bill, or is there something in the bill that would either enable them to manage deer that were impacting on their land somewhere else, or what powers they would have to kind of try and instigate deer management plans to stop that impact on their own land.
Yeah, there is already, as you know, there is already provision for tenants you're talking about to be able to control deer for marauding and stuff like that. So there is something in here. Section 26 of the 1996 Act gives occupiers the right to take deer where they may not otherwise have the right to do so, and that includes enclosed woodland and some agricultural land where deer are causing damage. And the Deer Working Group recommended that Section 26 be extended to provide that occupiers can take action to prevent damage by wild deer across any type of land and cover public interests of a social, economic and environmental nature. The rationale for that was largely over the last 30 years types of occupiers have changed. So there is provision there already, but if there was anything else that we needed to look at, then happy to hear about it.
Okay, it's just that they can do that on the land they tenant, but not in the land where the deer may be kind of the excess numbers of deer are actually impacting on their land. I'm not saying that properly, but the deer move about, and if they don't catch them in the act, then they can't do anything.
It's a very good point, and we can take a further look at that.
Okay, thank you.
Would you like to ask your next question, Rhoda?
Yep. Let me just get to it. With regard to Nature Scott's investigatory powers, that's been reduced so that they only have to give a 5-day notice period when they can come in and ask for access to land and records. And I wonder how these measures are being communicated in a way to landowners that maintains trust, that they don't feel that they're going to be set up and kind of ambushed in a way.
Well, I think it's important to remember that it will not be Nature Scott will turn up in your door one day and give you a 5-day notice. There will have been plenty of engagement beforehand. Currently it sits at 14 calendar days, and this is 5 working days. The 14 calendar days has been shortened to 5 working days because I think there's a general understanding that you go through a process, but you know that something needs to be done quickly. Then 5 days' notice is adequate, particularly given the fact that Nature Scott will have tried to engage previously with whoever it is that's got the problem on their land.
So this will be the end of a process rather than the start of a process?
It will not be anywhere near the end of a process. The end of a process is way much further down the line. This is the start of the process that has been previously instigated by trying to communicate beforehand. Does that make sense?
Okay, so it won't come as a surprise.
No, it will not come as a surprise. If somebody's got a 5-day notice, then Nature Scott will have already made contact with them to say that we have a concern. We'd like to have a conversation with you about it. And if they get stonewalled, if they get blanked, if they get refused, then Nature Scott will come back and say, right, we need to have this conversation now.
Okay. And would there be the opportunity, say someone was away, 5 days isn't very long, would there be the opportunity to negotiate a change of that? Well,
that's why we're making it electronic, so that people will get that 5-day notice to say, yeah, we want 5 days notice. But clearly, if somebody's not on their place, it would be sensible and legitimate to say, look, I'm not going to be back until such and such. As long as they don't say, I won't be back until September, and this is going out in February, then, you get the point I'm making. Yeah. Yes, there will be flexibility, but only within the bounds of reasonableness.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask Emma for a question on data before moving on to our next section on registered of authorised people? Thanks,
sure.
Emma.
Thanks, convener. I'll be pretty succinct. So we know that we need robust data in making decisions in terms of deer management. And we know that different densities of deer cause different damage. So I'm interested in how do we, I suppose, given the need for robust data and decision making, especially in terms of deciding when to intervene on the grounds of nature restoration, how will the Scottish Government seek to address any gaps that exist in relation to deer population data?
Well, there is some disagreement with what the estimates are. We've got an estimate of about between 750 and 1 million deer that the Deer Working Group compiled through a range of different methods. That included data on distribution of Scotland's 4 species. But I accept that there is some dubiety, or at least there is some people don't believe what that data is telling us, and I absolutely accept that. One of the things that we were hoping to get out of this is that if people are using the Nature Scott app, that will give us a much clearer picture. It will give us a much clearer understanding of what the deer numbers are in particular areas as well. One of the things that I was quite struck by was the day I was out on Glenfalloch, was the fact that the 3 deer that were taken out that day, it was tagged as the exact spot through GPS of where those 3 deer were taken out, and that then goes into the database. So if we can get more and more people using that app, that builds up the data picture, and it gives us a much clearer understanding of what the deer population is. But I accept the fact that some people do not agree entirely with the numbers we've got, but I think we're working on fairly reasonable numbers. That is between 750,000 and 1 million deer, and that's where we are at the moment.
And using drones and different ways to gather the data is part of the ongoing data gathering.
Are we using drones to gather data?
So Nature Scott do carry out kind of deer census, I don't know what the census is, a deer census, and do gather data through deer counts as well. They use helicopters, they use other technology for that. So that is something that they are doing at the minute. They have a statutory duty to monitor deer populations, so they do use that to gather data. Some of the work that we're talking about with the DRAP is about increasing the data that we get from the land managers on the ground in terms of their call. So it's that kind of big picture of Nature Scott gathering data through technology and through counts, as well as getting the data from the people on the ground also.
Okay, thanks.
Can I ask, when is it likely that Nature Scott's app will be launched?
So it is being used at the minute in some parts of Scotland. It's not been rolled out nationally. We don't have a date. I don't have a date to give you just now. We're happy to write to you with a bit more detail in terms of when what they think that looks like. But it is being used in some places at present.
Grand, thank you. Tim Eagle.
Thank you, Convener. I'm conscious of time, Minister, but can I just quickly touch on, my understanding is that where there is a control scheme in place, that is on the title of the land, and that creates potentially a burden on that land in terms of sale. Have you given any thought to that? We've heard that in evidence. Have you given any thought to the potential effects on sort of land value and marketability?
Yes, we have. And I think the important thing is that the order stays with the land. And that's as it should be.
Okay, but if that is the case then, would you give consideration into amendment at stage 2 that where a new owner is coming in that really wants to work with Nature Scott, all of that goodwill we've already been talking about a lot this morning, where they want to have that you could then de-escalate that to a control agreement rather than a control scheme?
No, I think we would keep it on the control scheme at that stage in order to make sure, because people can say anything they like. The proof in the pudding is in the eating when they actually come in and start carrying out the measures that are required. So no.
But as it's set out in the bill at the moment, there is no procedure for that, is there? So actually, but you could introduce something that says after.
But Nature Scott can do that anyway. Oh. Nature Scott can de-escalate it if they believe then that things are being done in the appropriate manner.
The current Section 8 requires Nature Scott to do an annual review of any Section 8, and there is a process already to revoke a control scheme. So we don't think there's nothing that necessitates a provision for this specific circumstance.
Yes.
If Nature Scott did de-escalate it, and then the new owner then said that they were going to, and then didn't comply, Nature Scott would be back to square one. And then it's going to land back on the Minister's desk to sign it off, etc., etc. So if it stays with the land, the process is there. Because it's not about the individual, it's about the landscape scale management of the deer in that area. So if it stays in place, it's actually an incentive, I would say, for the people who are selling their land to make sure that they've got their deer management in place. So that if they're going to, you generally don't sell an estate, at the drop of a hat. So if that's one of the preparations that you have to do to make sure there is no deer order on your estate, then that would be a good thing from their point of view.
So your advice is make sure you're doing your deer management, and then you're not going to be selling it with a control scheme in place.
It would be far beyond my remit to be giving advice on how people should sell their land, but I will leave that thought there with you.
We're going to jump back now to Register of Authorised Persons, and I've got a first question from Emma Harper.
I can't find the question, actually.
OK, we're going to kick off that section just to ask what evidence or data suggests that moving to a mandated level of competence is required.
We want a baseline of confidence across everyone who's going out to shoot deer. That's not just about deer welfare, it's about public concern, public safety, especially with increasing numbers of deer population and more venison entering the food chain. And if we've got everyone with the same level of baseline competence, we can guarantee that everyone has the same level of basic food hygiene training and the understanding of shot placement and when not to shoot. We know that most of our deer stockers are very competent. There's no doubt about that. But there is evidence that that's not 100% the case. There is evidence of wounding rates of between 6 and 17% that is too high for us to ignore. So now I had a roundtable session yesterday with BASC, and they clearly laid out all their concerns around the issues about what fit and competent is, and I absolutely accept that there are concerns there. But when we did the consultation on this, we had 69% from the land management and deer sporting organisations agreed that there should be a fit and competence base level. And 74% of all respondents said yes. So there is evidence that it is definitely what the public would expect us to do at this stage. And it's also something that the industry, notwithstanding BASC's position that they clearly laid out to me yesterday, there's clear evidence from other sectors within the deer management groups that they think that this is the right thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Emma, do you have a supplementary on that?
Thanks. I found the question. I know it's been a long morning. I'm interested to hear how the government will ensure that competence standards under the proposed register don't create like an undue financial or administrative barriers, particularly for experienced but uncertified stalkers. I know that we've got some of the organisations that I have met are interested in how do we support with transitional measures like grandfather rights, for instance, for experienced stalkers who've been they know the land, they know what they're doing, they're very experienced, but is there a way that we can help support them in that transition?
Well, this is going to come in secondary legislation, and we're more than happy to look at it leading up to stage 2. What all of the concerns are that were raised with me yesterday, and the other evidence that you have heard yourself in the committee. So we're more than happy to have a look at that. And whether that's, I'm not going to say what it is, but we are more than happy to have a look at it. I understand that there is some pushback on it, but I'm going to go back to the original point that I was making, that 69% from land management, deer sporting organisations said that this should be the baseline. It will give public confidence when we're talking about trying to get venison into the public psyche as a good product to eat, which is what it should be, as opposed to being seen as a problem. So I think there's an awful lot of positives to take out of getting that baseline. How we actually implement it, let us have a look at that and see if we can make sure that it's manageable.
Okay.
Thank you. Just for clarification, what is the definition of accompanied for visitors when it comes to especially the legal responsibilities and safe deer stalking?
Yeah, again, we will have a look at that. I know that Ross Ewing raised this in one of the previous sessions, whether it's sight, whether you see somebody or you can hear somebody. So let us have a look at what that means, and we will flesh that out as well. Okay. Sam wants to come in as well.
I think just to add to that, I don't think accompanied is set out in the legislation. So I think the word that's used is supervised. So I think it's just worth a point of clarification around that before we go down the sort of accompanied route.
Okay, that's helpful. Rhoda Grant.
We were speaking to stakeholders. Some expressed a concern about the levels of competence required. So especially for people who are new to the industry, to be able to stalk at night, to be able to shoot deer in woodland, they felt that the competence, the training required was not really adequate. In fact, they felt that new stalkers with that level of training could actually be reasonably dangerous in some situations. And I wonder if there has thought been given, not to those who have got a huge amount of experience, but those who are coming into the industry to have, I suppose, bespoke training for the more difficult situations like night stalking and stalking in woodland.
Yeah. They don't need any training at the moment. So, that kind of answers the argument that we really should be doing something. And as I've just said in my previous answer, we will bring this in at stage 2. We will look at what's the best way to manage those that have been stocking for 30, 40 years, who are, more than competent but don't have that certificate to say so, and then how we're going to manage the transition into making sure that everybody gets up to that fit and competent state. So I absolutely take on board the point that you're making, but right now they don't need anything at all. All they have to do is have a gun licence.
If I might add just very briefly, you talked a little bit, I think, specifically about night shooting and that kind of thing. There are slightly separate arrangements at present for night shooting in terms of the authorisation and the competence standard that is required, and we will look at that also in terms of the secondary legislation. For those kind of circumstances, there might need, well, we envisage there will be a higher standard of competence from the baseline competence, and that is the same as it is at the moment.
My apologies, I didn't really mention the night shooting. That was me not listening. My apologies.
Okay. Beatrice Wishart.
Yeah, my question's about stray farm deer. Section 32 of the bill introduces an offence of failing to report the taking or killing of a stray farm deer. Are there any specific guidelines or examples of what would constitute acceptable mitigating circumstances that would serve as a defence?
Well, all they've got to do is report it. All they have to do is report it. It's not a case of they have committed an offence for shooting a stray deer. As long as if they shoot a deer and it turns out to be a farm deer, all they have to do is report it within 5 days. Is it 5 days? Yeah, within 5 days. That's all that is required.
Okay.
Okay, we'll move on to our final theme on licensing for dealing in venison. A question from Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, can I ask you, how will the government maintain that public confidence in venison if the venison dealer licence scheme is removed? I think it's fair to say that we've had some mixed views on this. There is quite strong support for removing it to kind of bring a bit more flexibility to the market who can sell venison, but at the same time I think some dealers and companies looking back at the 2015 E. coli outbreak, and there's a kind of residual fear around public confidence. So I don't know how you're intending to kind of address that, both food safety and wider public confidence in venison as a healthy product.
Well, the venison dealer's licence wasn't about food safety, it was to prevent poaching. That was its purpose. And then if venison is being sold, it will be sold through the same rigour as any other game would be sold. So in terms of building that confidence, that's more about us marketing the product rather than... I think there was some confusion over Food Standard Scotland's position on this. Food Standard Scotland are quite comfortable with us moving the venison dealer's licence because it will still have to go through the rigour that any food product would go through in order to get it in the human food chain. But I think there is a much bigger piece here about how we market this product as something that we want people to eat, because removing an extra 50,000 head of deer a year is one thing, but rather than seeing it as a problem, I think we should really be trying to see it as an opportunity and saying that this is another iconic Scottish food that we should be celebrating, and I will do everything I can to make sure that we get to that position.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Does QMS potentially have a role in giving confidence relating to health? So not about necessarily marketing the product, but actually a role in ensuring confidence that deer that are killed on a hill can safely reach the food supply chain?
No, I think QMS have got more than enough on their plate dealing with the products that they are dealing with. I think venison is a fairly unique product, and I think we should be marketing it as such. And I think there's a lot of stuff that we can do. It doesn't require it to be under the umbrella of a QMS. So, and it's not something that we'd need to legislate on either. So I think it's fine the way it is.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
Just on the kind of promotion and getting more venison eaten in our local communities, have you plans for kind of looking at infrastructure, things like deer larders, chillers, micro-processing units? There's some good examples of things going on, but what is government's role and what are government doing to make sure that there is more of that to get it into the food chain?
Yeah, well, you took part in the debate last week when we talked about this. There are things happening. We've got 3 pilot projects, 3 on the go, or is it 2 on the go and 1 to be done? So stuff is happening just now in the pilot projects. There is the venison that has been what's the name of the island? Remind me.
Oh, Jura.
Jura. There's the one in Jura. There's also stuff getting into NHS boards. We've also got the Good Food Nation plan, Good Food Nation Act, where the plans will set out how people should engage in food in their local area. So I'd be encouraging local authorities to really consider how they are going to see venison as a product which is, as the convener said, it's a very healthy product. It's one that we should be proud of and one we should be promoting to our schools, our colleges, and as many different opportunities as we can. I'm seeing far more venison on the supermarket shelves now. I regularly buy my dad's venison burgers. He's found a newfound love for venison burgers. So, you know, the more that we can do as consumers to actually consume the product, it becomes part of our national diet, and I think that's something we should always try to do.
Is there a way that some of those infrastructure improvements could also be used for other meat, like beef and lamb and chicken? And because one of the big issues is that we kind of meat travels, food miles, huge food miles, and rather than that, could we try and keep all of that within the local food chain?
There may be some technical issues in that we'd have to look into, but I hear the point that you're making.
There is a difference to some extent in terms of wild game, especially when it comes to wild deer, and processing other meat in facilities often need to be quite different. But on your point about infrastructure, just to add to that, Nature Spot have been looking through those pilot projects at infrastructure, and they'll keep doing that, and we're keen to hear from stakeholders on where there might be more support for infrastructure. The point of kind of venison plus beef is a bit more difficult, and probably a bit more difficult than it's worth doing when we can look at alternatives that might work better, basically.
Okay.
Chance to say that delighted that Dumfries and Galloway Health Board are one of the first to adopt the sustainable and climate-friendly food provision. So that's an example of it working. Emma Harper and then Tim Eagle.
You kind of mentioned it already. You talked about Jura. I mean, in the debate last week, we heard there were 6 primary schools that have adopted venison into the school diet. So I'm just assuming that we will seek to learn how they did that, and that way we can learn from who's implemented it already, like the convener says at Dumfries and Galloway NHS board as well. So that's pretty much my point.
Every local authority will be producing a Good Food Nation plan, so we can all encourage our local authorities to look at how venison fits into that Good Food Nation plan.
Sadly, we're not going to have the opportunity because of the legislative burden to look at the Good Food Nation, and I think we need to absolutely put that on the record. Tim Eagle.
Minister, it's just a very good question about the BRIA. As far as I'm aware, that's not been published yet. When do we think that will be coming?
So, just been checking with our publishers. Fingers crossed it should be published this week. Apologies for the delay, but as soon as it's been published, then we will let the committee clerks know so that they can pass that to you.
Excellent, thank you.
And that concludes our session this morning. So thank you very much, Minister, and your officials for your input this morning. We're now going to move into private session, and I suspend this meeting.